Hello everyone. I know you used this video to fall asleep, but before you do, let me know where you're from and what time you're watching. Now just get cozy and enjoy. I've been a firefighter for 10 years and I thought I'd seen it all, but nothing could have prepared me for that night. We received the call around midnight, just as the city was settling into a deep, quiet sleep. A fire had broken out in an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the first time we'd been called to that place, but this time felt different. The air was thick with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I grabbed my gear and hopped onto the truck with my team. The drive over was tense. The radio buzzed with updates, and as we got closer, we could see the orange glow against the dark sky. It was a big one. Flames were licking the side of the building like it was a living, breathing thing. When we arrived, the chief gave the usual orders. We split up, some handling the hoses, others securing the perimeter. I was assigned to search and rescue. Even though the building was supposed to be empty, protocol is protocol. I took a deep breath and stepped into the inferno. The heat hit me like a wall, but I pushed through. The smoke was thick, stinging my eyes and filling my lungs. I shouted into the darkness, "Is anyone there?" But my voice was swallowed by the roaring flames. My flashlight beam cut through the smoke, revealing the charred remains of what used to be a grand lobby. As I moved forward, something strange happened. I stepped into a hallway, and suddenly, the air felt different. Cooler. The thick smoke was gone. I blinked and looked around, disoriented. The flames had disappeared, replaced by a dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with oil paintings, and the floor was covered in a plush red carpet. What the hell? I muttered, my voice echoing back to me. It was as if I'd stepped into another building entirely. I turned around, but the door I'd come through was gone. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced it down. I was trained for high-pressure situations. I had to stay calm. I moved cautiously down the corridor, my boots sinking into the soft carpet. The air was musty, like an old library that hadn't been opened in decades. I passed a large, ornate mirror hanging on the wall and froze. My reflection stared back at me, but it was wrong. My face looked older, worn. My eyes were hollow, like I'd seen too much. I turned away, my heart pounding. I needed to find an exit, get back to my team. But as I reached the end of the hallway, I found myself standing in front of a heavy wooden door. Without thinking, I pushed it open. I stepped into a brightly lit room, completely different from the dim corridor I just left. It was a diner, straight out of the 1950s. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, and a jukebox was playing an old tune I vaguely recognized. The smell of greasy food hung in the air. I was too stunned to move. How had I gone from a burning building to this? I looked back, but the door I'd come through was gone. Again, it was like the building was shifting around me. I walked to the counter, half expecting someone to pop up and ask me for my order, but the place was empty. Plates of half-eaten food sat abandoned on the tables, and the coffee pot behind the counter was still steaming. "Hello." I called out, but there was no response. I moved behind the counter and picked up the coffee pot. It was hot, fresh. Someone had been here recently. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. I needed to get out. I spotted another door behind the counter and headed for it, hoping it would lead me back to the fire. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the handle. Then, with a deep breath, I pulled it open. The door swung open, and I found myself in what looked like a Victorian parlor. Heavy drapes covered the windows, and a chandelier hung from the ceiling. A fire crackled in the ornate fireplace, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I took a step forward, and the door slammed shut behind me. My breathing was ragged now. I didn't understand what was happening. Each room was like a different time period, like I was stepping through history. But how and why? I moved cautiously through the room, my eyes scanning every detail. A portrait of a stern-looking man hung over the fireplace, his eyes seeming to follow me as I moved. I shuddered and turned away, focusing on finding another door, another way out. I spotted one across the room, half hidden by a large bookshelf. I hurried over and pulled it open, praying this time it would lead back to the real world. Instead, I found myself in a cold, concrete room. It was a bunker with thick walls and metal doors. Old propaganda posters covered the walls, warning against nuclear attacks. A single flickering light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows. I was beginning to lose my grip on reality. This couldn't be happening. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. I moved forward, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The air was heavy, filled with the faint smell of dust and decay. I found a door at the end of the hallway and pushed it open, but instead of relief, a new wave of terror washed over me. I was back in the building lobby, but it was different now. The grand staircase was gone, replaced by a twisted, burnt-out husk. Flames licked at the walls, and the air was thick with smoke again. Is this real? I whispered to myself. Am I going crazy? I moved forward, desperate to find a way out. I could feel the heat of the fire now, could hear the crackling of the flames. But something compelled me to keep going, to keep opening doors. I felt like I was being drawn deeper into the heart of the building, into something dark and ancient. I pushed open another door, and my heart sank. It was a nursery filled with old wooden toys and a rocking chair that moved slowly back and forth, as if someone had just left. A sense of dread washed over me, and I knew, deep down, that I was not alone. I turned to leave, but the door had disappeared. My eyes darted around the room, looking for any escape. That's when I saw it, a small wooden door hidden behind a curtain. I ran to it, my heart pounding, and yanked it open. I stumbled into a room that was completely dark, except for a single spotlight shining down on a figure standing in the middle. It was a man, dressed in a firefighter's uniform, but his face was hidden in the shadows. Who are you? I demanded, my voice shaking. What is this place? The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized who it was. The man took a step forward, and the light caught his face. It was me. But it wasn't. His eyes were hollow, lifeless, and his skin was ashen, like he'd been dead for years. He opened his mouth to speak, and his voice was a raspy whisper that echoed through the room. You shouldn't have come here. I took a step back, my mind reeling. What do you mean? You're trapped, he said, his voice filling the room. Just like me, just like all of us. I looked around the room, and I could see them now. Other figures standing in the shadows watching. They were all firefighters, all wearing the same uniform. And they all had the same hollow eyes. I turned and ran, desperate to find a way out. I pushed through door after door, each one leading to another room, another time period. I was running out of breath, my lungs burning as I tore through the endless maze of the building. Finally, I burst through a door and found myself back in the burning lobby. I could see the exit, the bright red glow of the fire trucks outside. I sprinted toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. I was so close, just a few feet away, when the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, crashing through the floor and landing hard on a cold, stone surface below. The air was knocked out of me, and I struggled to my feet, looking around. I was in a basement, the walls covered in soot and ash. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and something else, something rotten. I tried to climb back up, but the hole I'd fallen through was gone. I was trapped. I turned, and there he was, the hollow-eyed version of me, standing in the corner of the room. You can't escape, he said, his voice low and mournful. You're part of this place now, just like I am. I backed away, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. I had to find a way out. I turned and ran, but the room seemed to stretch on forever, the walls twisting and warping around me. And then I saw it, a door half hidden in the darkness. I ran to it and threw it open, stumbling out into the night air. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. The cool air filled my lungs, and I looked up to see my team rushing toward me. They were shouting my name, their faces pale and frightened. What happened? The chief asked, his voice shaking. We lost contact with you. We thought. I looked back at the building, but it was different now. The flames were gone, and the walls were blackened and crumbling. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. I was inside, I said, my voice barely a whisper. But it was different. I saw. I trailed off, the memories flooding back. The rooms, the different time periods, the hollow-eyed version of myself. It all felt like a nightmare, something I couldn't escape. The chief put a hand on my shoulder, his eyes filled with concern. You're safe now, he said. We got you out. But as I looked back at the building, I knew the truth. I hadn't escaped. I could feel it, deep down, a connection to that place, to the rooms and the shadows. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I would never truly be free, because some fires never go out. I always thought of myself as a rational person, the kind who looks for logical explanations, rather than jumping to conclusions about things that go bump in the night. But some things, no matter how hard you try to rationalize, just don't have an easy explanation. It all started on a quiet Tuesday night in October, a night that seemed no different from any other, until the whispers began. I live alone in a small, one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building downtown. The rent is cheap, and I've always liked the charm of the place, the creaky wooden floors, the high ceilings, the large windows that let in plenty of light during the day. It's cozy in an old-fashioned kind of way. But that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. It was faint, barely audible, like the sound of someone muttering under their breath. I paused, brushed my teeth halfway to my mouth and listened. For a moment, there was nothing. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just the neighbors talking, and continued brushing my teeth. But as I turned off the bathroom light and headed to bed, I heard it again. A low, raspy whisper coming from my closet. I froze. My eyes locked onto the closet door, which was slightly ajar. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I stood there listening. The whispering continued, almost rhythmic, like a chant in a language I couldn't understand. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. It's just the pipes, I told myself, or maybe the wind. There's no one in your closet. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the pipes, and it certainly wasn't the wind. The sound was too deliberate, too human. I reached for the baseball bat I kept under my bed, just in case, and slowly walked over to the closet. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. With a quick flick of my wrist, I yanked the door open, bat raised, ready to defend myself against. What exactly? A monster? A ghost? But there was nothing. Just my clothes hanging neatly on their hangers, a couple of old shoeboxes on the floor, and the faint smell of mothballs. I let out a shaky laugh and lowered the bat. Get a grip, I thought. You're scaring yourself over nothing. I closed the closet door firmly and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept replaying that sound, that strange whispering that seemed to echo in my ears long after it had stopped. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind in the silence of the night. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. The next morning, the memory of the whispers seemed distant, almost unreal. I went about my day as usual, trying to put the whole thing out of my mind. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched long across my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me like a heavy blanket. I kept busy cleaning, watching TV, anything to keep my mind off the closet. But as midnight approached, a sense of dread washed over me. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I'd convinced myself there was nothing to be afraid of. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I slept with the light on. It didn't help. Around 2 a.m., the whispers started again. Louder this time, more insistent. I sat up in bed, heart racing, straining to make out the words. But it was just a jumble of sounds, like someone talking in their sleep. My gaze drifted to the closet door, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Don't open it, a small voice in my head warned. Just stay in bed. But I couldn't ignore it. I had to know what was making that noise. Gripping the bat tightly, I tiptoed over to the closet, each step heavy and hesitant. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I counted to 3 and swung the door open. Nothing. I felt a mix of relief and frustration. What was going on? Was I losing my mind? I shook my head and slammed the closet door shut. That's when I noticed it. A small, almost imperceptible crack had appeared in the back wall of the closet. It hadn't been there before, I was sure of it. I crouched down, peering closer. The crack seemed to pulse, like something was alive behind it. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold, rough surface, and felt a strange sensation, a faint vibration, almost like a heartbeat. I jerked my hand back, heart pounding. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want to find out. I backed away slowly, closed the closet door, and crawled back into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin like a scared child. I felt ridiculous, but I couldn't help it. I just wanted the night to end. The next few days were torture. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I called in sick to work, too exhausted and terrified to leave my apartment. I thought about calling someone, my sister, a friend, anyone, but what could I say? That my closet was whispering to me. They'd think I was crazy. Hell, I thought I was crazy. But the whispers didn't stop. Every night, they grew louder, more distinct. It was like they were calling to me, urging me to listen. And every night, I would stand in front of that closet door, bat in hand, terrified but unable to look away. Then one night, the whispers changed. They weren't just random mutterings anymore. They were saying my name. Emily. I felt my blood run cold. I dropped the bat and stumbled back, my legs weak with fear. This can't be happening, I thought, panic gripping me like a vice. But it was happening. The whispers were real, and they knew my name. I don't know what came over me, but I knew I had to get out of there. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the apartment, not stopping until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life. I drove around aimlessly, trying to calm down, trying to think. I ended up at a diner on the edge of town, the kind that stays open all night. I ordered coffee and sat there, staring blankly at the mug in front of me, my mind racing. I didn't go back to the apartment that night. Instead, I slept in my car, parked in the diner's lot. It wasn't comfortable, and I barely slept, but at least I felt safe. The next morning, I called my landlord and asked if he knew anything about the apartment's history. He was evasive, but after some prodding, he admitted that the previous tenant had moved out suddenly. She said she couldn't stand the noise, he muttered. I felt a chill run down my spine. I pressed him for more information, but he climbed up, clearly regretting he'd said anything at all. I hung up, my mind whirling. I had to go back. I had to know what was happening in that closet. That evening, armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, I returned to the apartment. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor as I stood in front of the closet door, my heart pounding in my chest. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The crack in the wall seemed larger now, the pulsing stronger. I reached out, hesitating for just a moment before pressing the crowbar into the crack. With a sharp twist, the plaster crumbled, revealing a dark, gaping hole. I shone the flashlight into the opening, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something, an intense, oppressive presence that made my skin crawl. And then I heard it again. Emily. The whisper was so close, it felt like it was right next to my ear. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that closet as possible, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. Emily. The voice was louder now, more insistent. It was coming from the hole in the wall. I felt tears sting my eyes as I backed away, shaking my head. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But it was. The air in the room grew cold, so cold I could see my breath in front of me. I shivered, my whole body trembling. And then, slowly, something began to emerge from the hole. It was a hand. Pale and thin, with long, spindly fingers that stretched out, reaching for me. I let out a strangled scream and bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me. I could hear the whispers growing louder, more frantic, as I ran down the hall and out of the apartment. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for air, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I collapsed onto the sidewalk, my mind spinning. What had I just seen? What was happening in that apartment? I didn't have any answers, but I knew one thing. I couldn't go back. I drove to my sister's house and begged her to let me stay. I didn't tell her the whole story, just that I was having trouble at my apartment and needed a place to crash. She looked worried but didn't press me for details, thank God. For the next few nights, I stayed with her, trying to put the whole thing out of my mind, but it wasn't easy. I kept hearing that whisper over and over again, echoing in my mind. Emily, Emily. I knew I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to come back. And then one night, I got a phone call. It was my landlord. He sounded panicked, his words tumbling out in a rush. You have to come back, he said, his voice shaking. It's your apartment. There's something wrong. I didn't want to go, but something in his voice, fear, desperation, made me agree. I drove back to the building, my heart in my throat. The hallway was dark and empty as I made my way to the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the key. The apartment was cold and dark, the air heavy with the scent of dust and something else. Something metallic, like blood. I hesitated at the door to the bedroom, my hand hovering over the handle. "Emily." The whisper was so loud now, so clear, that it sent a shiver down my spine. I pushed the door open slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The closet door was wide open, the hole in the wall gaping like a mouth. And standing in front of it, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror, was my landlord. "I tried to seal it up," he whispered, his voice shaking. "But it won't stop, it won't stop." And then, before I could react, something dark and twisted reached out from the hole, wrapping around his neck. I screamed as he was yanked into the closet, his body disappearing into the darkness. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, echoing in my head. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and ran out of the apartment, not stopping until I was in my car, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I just knew I had to get away. I never went back to that apartment. I left the city, moved in with my sister, and tried to forget. But some nights, when the house is quiet and the wind is howling outside, I can still hear it. "Emily." A faint whisper calling me back, reminding me of the darkness that still waits behind that closet door. I never thought moving into my grandmother's house would lead to the most terrifying experience of my life. My wife, Sarah, and I had just started our family, and the thought of living in a large old house seemed perfect for our 2 little kids. It was a bit run down, sure, but it had charm. The kind of charm you can't find in modern houses with their shiny surfaces and lack of character. We moved in during spring, thinking the pleasant weather would help us settle in quickly. The house was filled with memories and a strange sense of nostalgia. My grandmother had lived here for over 50 years, and after she passed, it had been sitting empty for almost a decade. I used to visit her here as a child, running around the creaky wooden floors, my feet echoing through the large empty rooms. But I had forgotten about the basement. It wasn't until a week after we moved in that I remembered the old, cobweb-covered door that led down to it. It was hidden away in the kitchen, behind the pantry door. I was looking for a place to store some of the junk we didn't need and stumbled upon it. The basement door had this cold, metal latch that sent shivers down my spine the moment I touched it. I chalked it up to the chill of the basement air seeping through the cracks. I called Sarah over, and we decided to check it out together. After all, we needed more storage space, and who knew what we'd find down there? Maybe some of Grandma's old treasures or antiques we could use around the house. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and pushed the door open. The smell hit us first. A thick, musty odor of dampness and something else I couldn't quite place. Sarah wrinkled her nose, and I laughed it off, trying to be brave. The stairs creaked as we descended into the darkness. Dust particles floated in the air, glinting like tiny stars in the beam of light. The basement was huge, bigger than I remembered. Boxes were stacked along the walls, covered in thick layers of dust and cobwebs. Old furniture, picture frames, and rusty tools were scattered around. It was like a graveyard of forgotten things. Then we saw it, the trunk. It was tucked away in the corner, half buried under old blankets and a rusty bicycle. It looked ancient, with dark, almost black wood and thick iron straps holding it together. A massive padlock dangled from the latch, but the metal had corroded so badly that it crumbled at the slightest touch. "I don't remember seeing this before," I said, glancing at Sarah. She shrugged, curiosity lighting up her eyes. "Let's open it," she suggested, and I couldn't help but agree. There was something magnetic about that trunk, like it was calling to us. I pushed the lid open, and a cold draft washed over us, almost as if the trunk had been holding its breath all these years and had just exhaled. The contents inside made me shiver, and not because of the cold air. Clothes. That's what we found first. Old, tattered clothes that looked like they belonged to another era. Dresses made of faded silk and lace, suits with high collars and frayed cuffs. Everything was musty and crumbling, like it had been down here for centuries. There were shoes too, small, delicate shoes that looked like they were made for a child. "This is weird," Sarah muttered, holding up a small dress. "These must be from, what, the 1800s. maybe early 1900s. I nodded, feeling a little uneasy. But why would Grandma have these? She never mentioned anything like this. And who would lock up a bunch of old clothes? Then I saw it. A photograph tucked inside one of the pockets of a coat. I pulled it out, wiping the dust off with my sleeve. The photo was yellowed and brittle, but the image was clear. A family standing in front of this very house. A man, a woman, and 3 children, all dressed in the same kind of clothes we just found. They were smiling, but there was something off about it, something that made my stomach turn. "Who are they?" Sarah asked, peering over my shoulder. "I don't know," I whispered, "but look at the date." In the corner of the photo, someone had scribbled a date in ink, July 17, 1892. "This is impossible," I said, shaking my head. The house wasn't even built until the 1920s. We both stared at the photo, then at the clothes, trying to make sense of it. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, but none came. It was like we'd opened a door to the past, one that should have stayed shut. The kids' voices echoed down the stairs, snapping us out of our days. We quickly closed the trunk and hurried back upstairs, the photograph still clutched in my hand. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting back to the family in the photograph. Who were they? And why did their belongings end up in our basement? The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to forget about the trunk, telling myself it was just some old junk my grandmother had collected over the years. But strange things started happening around the house. It started with little things, doors creaking open on their own, cold spots that would appear out of nowhere. Then the kids started talking about a new friend they had met. "She's really nice," my daughter, Emma, said one evening as we sat down for dinner. "She has a pretty dress and she plays with me and Tommy in the basement." I froze, the fork halfway to my mouth. "What did you say, sweetie?" "Our friend," she repeated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "She lives in the basement. Can she come upstairs to play with us?" I glanced at Sarah, who looked just as freaked out as I felt. We had never let the kids go into the basement alone. In fact, we had locked the door after we found the trunk, not wanting them to get hurt on the stairs or among the old, rusty things down there. "Emma," Sarah said gently, "there's no one in the basement, honey. You must be imagining things." Emma frowned, looking genuinely confused. "But I see her every day, Mommy. She looks just like the girl in the picture Daddy found." My heart skipped a beat. The girl in the picture. I had almost forgotten about that. But hearing my daughter mention her, it brought all the fear rushing back. How could she know about the girl? We had hidden the photograph, not wanting to scare them. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why don't we stay out of the basement for a while? Okay, it's too dusty down there." Emma shrugged and went back to eating, but the uneasy feeling in my gut didn't go away. That night, after the kids were asleep, I pulled the photograph out of the drawer where I had hidden it. I stared at the family, at the little girl with her haunting smile, and I knew we had to get rid of that trunk. Sarah agreed. We decided to take it out the next day, load it into the truck, and drive it as far away from the house as possible. But that night, something happened that changed everything. I woke up to a noise. A soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The sound was coming from the basement. I grabbed the flashlight and tiptoed down the stairs, careful not to wake Sarah or the kids. The house was eerily silent, the only sound my own breathing and the creak of the floorboards under my feet. I reached the basement door and paused. The air was cold, much colder than it should have been for a spring night. I hesitated, my hand on the latch, then slowly pushed the door open. The light from my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the old, dusty steps. I descended slowly, each creak of the stairs sending chills down my spine. When I reached the bottom, I shone the light around the basement, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the same old boxes, the furniture, and the trunk. I breathed a sigh of relief and turned to go back upstairs. That's when I heard it. A soft whisper coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The trunk was open, the lid lifted just enough to see the contents inside. I took a step closer, my hands shaking. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I had to know. I shone the flashlight into the trunk, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The clothes were gone. In their place were bones. Human bones, yellowed with age, piled up like some mech of a puzzle. And there, on top of the pile, was the dress. The same dress the little girl in the photograph had been wearing. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting crazy shadows on the walls. The whispering grew louder, filling the basement with a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I grabbed the flashlight and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I could still hear the whispers, muffled now but still there, like the house itself was breathing. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the living room, the photograph in my hand, my mind racing. I had to get rid of that trunk. I had to get my family out of this house. But when morning came, the trunk was gone. We searched the entire basement, every corner, every box, but it had vanished. The only thing left was the photograph, now lying in the middle of the floor. The little girl's face seemed different, her smile wider, almost mocking. We packed up that day, grabbing what we could and piling it into the car. I didn't care about the house, about the memories. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. We drove to a hotel, the kids asking questions we couldn't answer, Sarah staring out the window, her face pale and drawn. That night, as we sat in the hotel room, I got a text. It was from my own phone number. "Why did you leave? We're not done playing yet." I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. Sarah grabbed it, her eyes widening as she read the message. We both knew what it meant, but neither of us said a word. What could we say? That the house was haunted. That the family in the photograph was somehow still there, still waiting. We didn't go back. We sold the house, losing money but gaining our sanity. But even now, I can't escape the feeling that we left something behind. Something that's still waiting, still whispering. Every now and then, I get a text from that same number. Always the same message. "Come back. We miss you." And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think I hear a voice. A soft whisper, calling from the basement. "We're still here." I know I'll never go back, but I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we had stayed. If we had opened that trunk one more time. Maybe it's better not to know. You know that feeling when you're the last one left in a big empty building? Everything seems bigger, the silence gets louder, and every little noise sets your heart racing. I work at a manufacturing plant, doing shifts on the assembly line. It's usually noisy with the clanking of machines, the hum of conveyor belts, and the chatter of my coworkers. But when I work the late shift alone, that's when things get weird. I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts or anything like that. I've always thought I was pretty rational, grounded in reality. But the things I've seen lately are hard to explain. It started about 2 months ago. The plant was running behind on orders, so the management asked for volunteers to do some overtime. I needed the money, so I signed up. That first night, I remember looking around at the empty factory floor. It was almost eerie how different it felt without the usual crowd. Just me, surrounded by rows of silent machines. Everything was fine until around midnight. That's when I heard the first noise. It was a faint whirring sound coming from the far end of the plant, where the older machines were. I walked over to check it out, thinking maybe I'd left something on by mistake. But when I got there, everything was off. Not even a single light on the control panel. Must be my imagination. I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I went back to my station, finished my shift, and went home. I convinced myself it was nothing. The next few nights, the noises kept happening. Sometimes it was a grinding sound, other times it was a loud clank, like metal hitting metal. Always from different parts of the factory. I'd go check, and it was always the same. Nothing was on, nothing was out of place. I told myself it was just the building settling, or maybe the old machinery cooling down. But then, about a week into my late shifts, I saw something that I couldn't explain away. I was stacking boxes near the loading dock when I noticed a light flickering in the back. It was one of those old overhead lights, the kind that buzzes and hums. I thought it might be a short circuit or something, so I walked over to take a look. As I got closer, I saw one of the machines was running. It was a large, ancient-looking piece of equipment we rarely used anymore. The gears were turning slowly, making this awful screeching noise. My first thought was someone was messing with me, maybe one of the guys from the day shift trying to freak me out. But I was alone. I knew I was alone. I walked up to the control panel, but the machine was unplugged, completely disconnected from any power source. I stood there, staring at it, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The gears ground to a halt, and the factory was silent again. I wanted to tell someone, but I knew how it would sound. Hey, the machines are coming to life on their own when I'm working alone. Yeah, right. I'd be the laughingstock of the whole plant. So, I kept it to myself and decided maybe it was time to stop doing the late shifts. But every time I tried to back out, something came up. A bill I needed to pay, or management would sweeten the overtime pay, and I'd find myself agreeing to just one more night. Things got worse. One night, I was down by the assembly line, checking inventory, when all the machines in the row turned on at once. The noise was deafening. Conveyor belts started moving, robotic arms whirred to life, and the smell of burning metal filled the air. I ran over to the control panel, slamming every switch off, but it didn't do anything. I stood there, helpless, watching as the machinery went through its motions like it was possessed. Then, just as quickly as it started, it all stopped again. Dead silence, except for the pounding of my heart. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I went to my supervisor the next day, trying to explain what was happening. I kept it vague, just saying the machines were malfunctioning, maybe a wiring issue or something. He gave me this look, half annoyed, half amused, and told me they'd check it out. But nothing changed. The maintenance guys didn't find anything wrong, and the next night I was back in the factory alone. I decided to keep my phone handy just in case. If it happened again, I'd record it, prove I wasn't losing my mind. That night was the worst one yet. I'd barely been there an hour when the lights started flickering. It wasn't just one or two. The whole factory seemed to be having a power surge. I grabbed my phone, hit record, and started walking through the plant, narrating everything as I went. I was almost at the back of the factory when I heard it. A low, grinding noise, like something heavy being dragged across the concrete floor. I turned the corner and froze. One of the massive stamping machines, the kind we use to shape metal parts, was moving. Not running, moving. It was sliding slowly across the floor, leaving deep grooves in the concrete. My first instinct was to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I kept filming as it inched its way toward me, the sound of metal scraping against concrete echoing through the factory. Then it stopped. For a moment, everything was still. I could hear my own ragged breathing, feel the sweat dripping down my back. Then, all at once, every machine in the plant roared to life. The noise was overwhelming, a cacophony of grinding gears, slamming metal, and hissing steam. I dropped my phone and bolted for the exit, but the doors wouldn't open. I yanked on the handle, screaming, but they were locked tight. I turned around, and the machines were moving. Not just the stamping machine, all of them. They were shifting, turning, almost like they were trying to get closer. I backed away, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped. Then, in the midst of the chaos, I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the factory floor. It was tall, almost impossibly so, with long, spindly arms that seemed to stretch and twist around the machines. It didn't have a face, just a dark, shadowy form that seemed to pulse and shimmer in the dim light. It raised one of its arms, and the machines around it responded, clanking and grinding like they were alive. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, as it moved toward me, its body shifting and changing with every step. I don't know how long I stood there frozen. It felt like an eternity. But then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The machines went silent, the lights flickered back to normal, and the figure vanished. I ran out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for breath. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't think I want to know. I quit the next day, told them I couldn't do it anymore. They tried to convince me to stay, offered me a raise, even a different shift. But I couldn't. I didn't go back to get my things. I left it all there, my locker, my tools, even my phone with the video on it. It wasn't worth it. I don't know what's going on in that factory, and I don't want to find out. All I know is something isn't right. Something is in there, something that shouldn't be. And it's only a matter of time before it finds what it's looking for. I still have nightmares about that place. Sometimes I dream that I'm back there, alone in the dark, with the machines all around me. And in the shadows, I see that figure, watching, waiting. I hope I never have to go back there. But deep down, I know it's not over. Whatever it is, it's still in there, lurking in the darkness. And one day, it's going to get out. It all started on a lazy Sunday afternoon. I was alone in my apartment, enjoying the rare quiet that city life offered, when I first noticed something strange. I was washing my hands in the bathroom, staring at my reflection, absent-mindedly counting the few gray hairs sprouting from my temple. It was a mundane moment, one of those fleeting instances where you see yourself for who you really are, with no distractions. Then something caught my eye. Behind me, reflected in the mirror, was a shadowy figure standing near the doorway. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart skipped a beat. I quickly dismissed it as a trick of the light, perhaps a shadow cast by the plants on the balcony. I shook my head and chuckled at my own paranoia, but the image of that figure lingered at the back of my mind. Days went by, and I didn't think much about it. But that was just the beginning. The following week, I was brushing my teeth before bed, the usual nightly routine. As I rinsed my mouth, I looked up at the mirror and froze. There he was again. The figure. Only this time he was closer, standing just a few feet behind me. His outline was clearer now, tall and gaunt, his features obscured by shadows. I felt a chill run down my spine. I spun around once more, my heart pounding in my chest. The bathroom was empty as it should be. I checked the entire apartment, even the closet, under the bed. Nothing. I was alone. I stood in front of the mirror again, almost afraid to look, but the figure was gone. I barely slept that night, the image of that shadowy presence haunting my thoughts. Who was he? Or rather, what was he? A few nights later, I decided to test it out. I'd heard somewhere that spirits couldn't cross salt lines or some nonsense like that. I wasn't superstitious, but I was desperate. So, I poured a thick line of salt across the bathroom doorway and stood in front of the mirror again, feeling foolish. At first, I saw nothing. I breathed a sigh of relief. But then, as I leaned closer to the mirror, there he was again, closer than ever before. I could almost make out his face now, though it was still shrouded in darkness. The salt hadn't worked. He stood right behind me, his head tilted slightly as if he were studying me. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, and I stumbled backward, my eyes wide with terror. The figure remained in the mirror, unmoving. I was too scared to even turn around this time, fearing that I might actually see him standing there. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the bathroom floor, the light flickering above me as if mocking my fear. The following morning, I woke up on the bathroom floor, my head aching from the awkward position I'd slept in. The memory of last night hit me like a ton of bricks. My first instinct was to rush to the mirror, but I stopped myself. I couldn't bear to look. Instead, I went about my day, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it all. But I couldn't escape him. Every time I passed by a reflective surface, a window, a puddle on the street, even the shiny surface of my phone screen, there he was. Always just a little bit closer, always watching. I stopped looking at mirrors altogether. I avoided anything that could show my reflection. But I knew he was still there, lurking just behind me, closing the distance day by day. I became a nervous wreck. I called in sick to work, too afraid to leave my apartment. I barely ate, barely slept. I was consumed by the thought of him, this shadowy figure that seemed to be slowly closing in on me. I even considered smashing all the mirrors in my apartment, but a small, terrified part of me was afraid of what might happen if I did. What if that was the only thing keeping him at bay? One night, after days of isolation and fear, I reached my breaking point. I had to know. I had to see him, face him, whatever he was. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, my hands trembling as I forced myself to look. He was right there, just inches away from me now. I could see his face, or what was left of it. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes. There was nothing but darkness where his eyes should have been. A twisted grin spread across his face, and I could see rows of sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But he didn't answer. Instead, his grin widened, and he raised a skeletal hand, pointing at something behind me. I turned around slowly, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. I glanced back at the mirror, and he was gone. My reflection stared back at me, pale and trembling, but alone. I let out a shaky breath, tears streaming down my face. Was I losing my mind? I stumbled out of the bathroom and collapsed onto my bed, my body shaking with sobs. I couldn't live like this. I needed help. I needed to tell someone, anyone. But who would believe me? They'd think I was crazy. Hell, I thought I was crazy. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed a bag and booked a hotel room across town. Maybe a change of scenery would help, I thought. Maybe getting away from that damn mirror would make things better. But it didn't. The first night in the hotel, I avoided the bathroom like the plague. I even covered the mirror with a towel just in case. But when I closed my eyes, I saw him. That grinning, twisted face. I couldn't escape him. I barely slept, and when I did, the nightmares came. He was there, always there, reaching out for me, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. This wasn't going to work. I had to find a way to get rid of him. I did some research, desperate for answers. I read about haunted mirrors, spirits trapped in reflective surfaces, all kinds of supernatural theories. Most of it seemed like nonsense, but I was willing to try anything at this point. One article suggested that breaking the mirror could release the spirit, but it came with a warning. Once the mirror is broken, the spirit would be free to cross into the real world. I didn't know what to believe, but I was out of options. I had to do something. I returned to my apartment, my hands shaking as I picked up a hammer. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my own terrified reflection. This was it. Either I ended this now, or I'd be haunted forever. I raised the hammer, my grip so tight my knuckles turned white. I hesitated for a moment, fear paralyzing me. But then I saw him again, his face inches from mine, that twisted grin spreading across his lips. I screamed and swung the hammer with all my strength. The mirror shattered, shards of glass raining down around me. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, a low, guttural laugh filled the room. I froze, the hammer slipping from my fingers. I turned around slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. He was there, standing in the middle of my bathroom, no longer confined to the mirror. His presence was overwhelming, his grin wider than ever. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice a raspy hiss that sent shivers down my spine. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What had I done? I'd set him free. He took a step toward me, and I felt a cold, suffocating dread wash over me. I turned and ran, but I knew it was too late. He was free now, and there was nowhere I could hide. I don't know how long I ran for. Hours, maybe days. I ended up in some dingy motel on the outskirts of town, my hands shaking as I tried to catch my breath. I thought I'd escaped him, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. I could still feel his presence, like a dark cloud hanging over me. I sat on the bed, staring at the blank TV screen. My reflection stared back at me, tired and broken. But then, I saw it, a flicker of movement behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. I looked back at the TV screen, and there he was, standing right behind me, his grin wider than ever. I screamed and threw the remote at the screen, shattering it. The image flickered and died, but I knew he was still there somewhere. I collapsed onto the bed, my body shaking with sobs. I couldn't escape him. He was everywhere now, in every reflection, every shadow. I was trapped, haunted by the thing I'd set free. And I knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before he reached me. I don't know how much time passed. Days bled together, each one worse than the last. I stopped eating, stopped sleeping. I was a shell of the person I used to be, haunted by the thing that followed me everywhere I went. And then one night, I saw him, really saw him. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling when I felt it, a cold, bony hand on my shoulder. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I turned my head slowly, my breath catching in my throat. He was lying next to me, his face inches from mine. His eyes, those dark, empty sockets, stared into mine, and I knew, in that moment, that there was no escape. "Thank you," he whispered again, his voice a cold, rasping hiss, "for setting me free." And then, everything went dark. I've been a zookeeper for almost 10 years now, and I've seen a lot of things. but nothing prepared me for that morning. It was an ordinary day, or at least it started that way. I arrived at the zoo around 5 a.m., just before dawn. The air was still and cold, carrying the faint scent of hay and animal musk. I always loved this time of day, the quiet before the chaos of visitors and noise. It felt like the zoo was alive, breathing peacefully before waking up. I began my rounds, checking on the animals, making sure they were fed and content. Most of them were still asleep, curled up in their enclosures. Everything seemed normal until I reached the carnivore section. The first thing that struck me was the silence. Usually, I'd hear some shuffling, a growl or two, but that morning, there was nothing. Just a heavy, unsettling quiet. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off. Maybe they were just resting. I moved to the cage of our most dangerous resident, a massive Siberian tiger named Misha. She was one of our star attractions, beautiful but deadly, with eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. Every time I saw her, I felt a mix of awe and fear. But that day, the fear took over. The cage was open. The lock was hanging off the door, and the heavy iron bars were pushed aside, as if they were made of straw. My heart dropped. I'd seen what Misha could do to a chunk of raw meat. The thought of her roaming freely was terrifying. I immediately reached for my radio to call for help, but my hand froze mid-air. A low, rumbling growl echoed from the shadows of the enclosure. I peered inside, squinting to see through the dim light. There she was, crouched in the far corner, her eyes gleaming in the darkness. She was staring right at me, unmoving, almost as if she had been waiting. My mouth went dry, and I felt a bead of sweat roll down my temple. The cage was open, but she hadn't escaped. Why? I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. Something about her gaze held me in place, like a snake mesmerizing its prey. I could see the muscles in her body tense, coiled, and ready to spring, but she didn't move. What the hell? I muttered under my breath, barely daring to breathe. That's when I noticed something even more unsettling. The cage door had been wrenched open from the inside. The bars were bent outwards, but there were no signs of a struggle, no claw marks, no broken chains. It was as if the door had been forced open by something, or someone, unnaturally strong. A strange sense of dread washed over me. I'd heard stories from the night guards about weird things happening around Misha's cage, voices in the night, shadows that didn't belong. I'd always chalked it up to overactive imaginations, or the influence of too many late-night horror movies. But now, standing there, I wasn't so sure. I took another step back, finally managing to break free from her gaze. I needed to get out of there, to call for help, but as I turned, I felt something cold brush against my arm. I looked down and saw nothing, just the empty air, but I swear it felt like fingers trailing down my skin. I stumbled, my heart racing, and fumbled for my radio. My voice came out shaky as I called for backup, telling them to get to the carnivore section fast. I barely got the words out before the radio went dead, the static cutting off abruptly. Panic gripped me, but I forced myself to move to run. I didn't look back until I was a safe distance away. When I did, Misha was still there, staring after me with those unblinking eyes. It felt like she was mocking me, like she knew something I didn't. The other keepers arrived within minutes, and I told them everything. They looked at the cage, at the bent bars, and then at Misha, who had now moved closer to the open door, but still hadn't tried to leave. It was like she was waiting for something or someone. We decided to lock her back in and secure the area until we could figure out what had happened. But as we closed the cage, I caught sight of something etched into the ground near the entrance. It was faint, almost invisible, but I recognized the shape. It looked like a symbol, an ancient one, something I had seen before in an old book about folklore and curses. I didn't say anything to the others. They were already spooked enough, and I didn't want to sound crazy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that this wasn't just a break-in or an accident. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Misha, about her eyes and the strange symbol on the ground. I tried to distract myself, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw her staring at me from the darkness of her cage. The next morning, I went back to the zoo, my nerves on edge. I half expected to find her gone, to see the cage open again, but everything seemed normal. The lock was in place, the bars were secure, and Misha was lying in the corner, her eyes half closed. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I walked around, checking on the other animals, I noticed something odd. There were scratch marks on the walls of their enclosures, deep gouges that hadn't been there the day before. And the animals, they were restless, pacing back and forth, their eyes wide with fear. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was like they sensed something they couldn't see but knew was there. I thought about the stories, the voices, the shadows. I had laughed them off before, but now I wasn't so sure. I made my way back to Misha's cage, my heart pounding. She was watching me again, her eyes following my every move. I felt that cold touch again, like invisible fingers trailing across my skin. I shivered, forcing myself to step closer. "What are you?" I whispered, more to myself than to her. She didn't answer, of course, but I saw something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, of understanding. And then she did something that made my blood run cold. She stood up, walked to the center of the cage, and lay down in the exact spot where the symbol had been. I froze, staring at her and then at the ground beneath her. The symbol was gone, erased as if it had never been there. But I knew what I had seen. I knew it wasn't my imagination. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. I thought about the book, about the stories of ancient spirits and curses. Could it be possible? Could Misha be more than just a tiger? I decided to do some research to see if I could find anything that matched what I had seen. I spent hours combing through old texts and articles, looking for clues. And then I found it. A story buried in the pages of an old folklore journal. It was about a creature, a spirit that could take the form of a great beast, bound to a place by a curse. It was said to be a guardian, a protector, but also a harbinger of doom. It would appear in the guise of an animal, watching, waiting, until the one who had summoned it fulfilled their fate. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Was that what Misha was, a guardian, or something worse? I went back to the zoo that night, long after everyone else had left. I needed to know, to see for myself. I stood outside her cage, my hands trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. "Misha," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She lifted her head, her eyes glowing in the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw something behind her, a shadow that didn't belong. It moved, shifting and writhing, and I felt that cold touch again, stronger this time. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wanted to run to get away, but I couldn't. Something was holding me there, something I couldn't see but could feel, like invisible chains wrapping around my body. And then I heard it, a voice, soft and echoing, like a whisper in the wind. "You shouldn't have come back." I spun around, but there was no one there. The zoo was empty, silent. I turned back to Misha, but she was gone. The cage was empty, the bars still intact, but she was gone. Panic surged through me, and I backed away, my heart racing. I stumbled, falling to the ground, and felt something cold and wet under my hand. I looked down and saw the symbol again, drawn in blood. My blood. The shadows around me seemed to grow darker, thicker, until I could barely see. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I felt something wrap around my throat, squeezing, and I knew I was going to die. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The darkness lifted, and I was alone, lying on the cold ground. I gasped for breath, my body trembling, and looked around. There was no sign of Misha, no sign of the shadows, but the symbol was still there, etched into the ground, glowing faintly in the moonlight. I ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the zoo, until I was far away from that place. I never went back. I couldn't. But I still see her sometimes, in my dreams, in the shadows of my room. I hear that voice whispering, warning me. And I know, deep down, that it's not over. The curse isn't broken, it's only just begun. Moving into a new house is supposed to be an exciting adventure, right? A fresh start, new memories, and a place to call your own. That's exactly what we thought when we bought this old, two-story house on the edge of town. It was a bit run down, sure, but it had character. And as soon as we stepped inside, we could picture our family filling the rooms with laughter and life. The day we moved in, everything felt normal. The house creaked in the way old houses do, and there was that musty smell that lingered in the air, like the house had been waiting for us. I remember my wife, Sarah, and our 2 kids, Lily and Tommy, running up and down the stairs, claiming their rooms. It was supposed to be the beginning of something wonderful. But that first night, we heard it. It was a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere downstairs. At first, I thought it was just a branch against the window, or maybe some rodent that had found its way inside. I shrugged it off and went back to sleep, thinking nothing of it. The next morning, Sarah mentioned hearing it too. "Did you hear that noise last night?" "It sounded like scratching, like something was trying to get in," she said over breakfast. "Probably just a raccoon," I replied, though I wasn't so sure. We went about our day, unpacking boxes and settling in. The kids were thrilled with the backyard, and Sarah was already making plans for how to redecorate. Everything felt like it was falling into place. But then we found the door. It was in the basement, behind an old, heavy bookshelf that the previous owners had left behind. Tommy was the one who discovered it, while we were sorting through boxes of old tools and paint cans. "Hey, Dad, there's a door back here," he called out, his voice echoing through the empty basement. I walked over curious. Sure enough, there it was, a small wooden door, maybe 3 feet high, hidden away like it didn't want to be found. The wood was dark, almost black, with iron hinges that looked ancient. It didn't seem to belong to the rest of the house, like it had been put there much later, or maybe much earlier. There was no doorknob, just a rusted keyhole that seemed to stare back at us. "What do you think is inside?" Tommy asked, his eyes wide with excitement. "Probably just an old storage space," I said, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that crept up my spine. "We'll check it out later. It's probably stuck from all the years of being closed up." We moved the bookshelf back and decided to forget about it for the time being. But that night, the scratching sound returned, louder this time, more insistent. It was coming from the basement. Sarah sat up in bed, her eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, feeling a chill run through me. "I'll go check it out." I grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the basement, I stood there listening. The scratching was coming from the hidden door, soft but relentless, like nails on wood. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. I don't know why I expected an answer. But all I got was more scratching, more desperate, like whatever was on the other side wanted out. I backed away and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. Sarah was waiting at the top, her face pale. "What is it?" she asked. "I don't know," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Probably just an animal trapped behind the wall." But deep down, I didn't believe that. And I don't think she did either. The next few days were tense. The scratching continued every night, growing louder, more frantic. It sounded like claws, scraping and digging like something or someone was trying to claw its way out. We tried to ignore it, telling ourselves it was just the house settling or some animal that would eventually find its way out. But then things started happening. It began with small things. Doors left open that we swore we had closed. Lights flickering even though the wiring was brand new. Strange cold spots that seemed to move through the house like a living thing. Lily's toys would be scattered across the floor in the morning, even though we had put them away before bed. And Tommy complained about nightmares, saying he saw shadows moving under his door at night. One evening, after a particularly loud bout of scratching, I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed a crowbar and headed down to the basement, determination and fear babbling inside me. Sarah tried to stop me, but I couldn't stand the thought of that noise, that thing, being there one more night. The door was as we'd left it, dark and ominous. I hesitated for a moment, my hand shaking as I reached out to touch the cold wood. Then, taking a deep breath, I wedged the crowbar into the small gap and pried with all my strength. The door didn't budge. I tried again, putting my weight into it, but it was like the door was glued shut, like something was holding it from the other side. And then I heard it, the scratching, right there, inches away, almost frantic now. I could feel the vibrations through the crowbar. Suddenly, a voice whispered, low and raspy, from the other side of the door. I couldn't make out the words, but it sent a wave of cold terror through me. I stumbled back, dropping the crowbar, and ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with fear. I don't know," I stammered. "But we need to get out of here." We packed our bags that night and left, staying at a hotel in town. I called a locksmith the next day, explaining the situation as best I could. The locksmith, an old man with a weathered face, seemed hesitant but agreed to come out and take a look. When we returned to the house, he examined the door, frowning. "This is old," he muttered. "Very old. You're sure it wasn't here when you moved in?" I nodded, feeling uneasy. He tried a few tools, but nothing worked. The door seemed to resist every attempt to open it. Finally, he stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. "I don't know what to tell you," he said, shaking his head. "I've never seen anything like this. It's almost like it doesn't want to be opened." We paid him and watched him leave, feeling more helpless than ever. That night, we heard the scratching again, louder than ever, like it was angry, like whatever was behind that door knew we tried to open it. Sarah wanted to leave, to sell the house and never look back. But we put everything we had into this place. We couldn't just walk away. So we stayed, hoping the noises would stop, hoping we could live with whatever it was. But then it got worse. One night, we were all in the living room, trying to distract ourselves with a movie. The scratching started again, followed by a low growling sound, like a deep, guttural breath. We froze, staring at each other in terror. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the basement door flew open. We watched in horror as the hidden door in the basement began to shake violently, as if something was throwing itself against it, trying to break through. Tommy started crying, and Lily clung to Sarah, her eyes wide with fear. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the basement door handle, my heart pounding. "We need to leave," Sarah screamed, grabbing the kids. We ran out of the house, the sounds of banging and scratching echoing behind us. We didn't stop until we were in the car, driving away as fast as we could. We spent the night in the car, too scared to even go to a hotel. The next day, we decided to sell the house. We didn't care about the money anymore. We just wanted to be safe. But when we returned to pack our things, the house was quiet. The basement door was closed, and there were no signs of anything unusual. I decided to take one last look to see if the door was still there, to see if it had all just been a nightmare. I crept down the stairs, my heart racing. The hidden door was still there, but something was different. The wood looked newer, the hinges not as rusted. It was like the door had changed, like it was mocking me. I reached out, and before I could stop myself, I touched the keyhole. A jolt of cold shot through me, and I stumbled back, gasping. And then I heard it, a soft, sinister laugh, coming from behind the door. I ran out of the basement, out of the house, and we never went back. We sold the house at a loss, not telling the new owners what we'd experienced. I don't know if the scratching ever stopped, if the thing behind that door ever got out. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it in my dreams, that sound of nails on wood, that desperate, angry scratching. And I know, deep down, that whatever it was, it's still there, waiting for someone to open the door, waiting to be set free. I never thought I'd become the main character in one of those creepy stories you'd hear around campfires. I mean, who would? Things like that happen to other people, right? Not to you. Not in your own quiet little town where nothing ever really happens. But I guess that's the thing about horror stories. They sneak up on you when you least expect them. It started with the first letter. I found it in my mailbox one chilly morning in late October. There was no return address, just my name, Sophie, scrawled across the front in a shaky, almost desperate handwriting. I shrugged it off as some prank, maybe from one of the kids in the neighborhood. But when I opened it, the content made me shiver. Stay away from the shadows. They're watching. No signature, no explanation, just that one cryptic sentence. I laughed it off, more out of nervousness than anything else. I mean, who wouldn't be spooked? But the rational part of my brain told me it was a joke. A weird, not funny joke. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. I left the lights on in every room, afraid of what might be lurking in the dark corners. I felt silly, paranoid even, but the letter stuck in my mind. Stay away from the shadows. What did that even mean? The next morning, I found another letter. This one was taped to my front door. Don't trust your reflection. Okay, now I was genuinely freaked out. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. Maybe some local kids were playing a trick on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. These letters felt personal, almost like they were trying to warn me. I decided to show them to my friend Emily. We had coffee that afternoon at our favorite cafe. She laughed when I told her about the letters. "Come on, Sophie, it's probably just some weirdo trying to mess with you. You know how people can be," she said, stirring her latte. "Yeah, but why me? And what's with these weird messages?" Emily shrugged. "Who knows? But don't let it get to you. It's just someone being creepy." She made it sound so simple, so easy to brush off, but I couldn't. The letters kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. "Don't answer the door after midnight. Your dreams aren't safe. They know your secrets." Every time I found a new letter, my heart would race. I started double-locking my doors and windows, not that it made me feel any safer. I even installed security cameras around the house, but whoever was leaving these notes never showed up on the footage. It was like they were invisible, slipping in and out of the shadows like they were part of them. By now, I was exhausted. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus at work, and every little noise made my skin crawl. My boss noticed my lack of concentration, but what could I tell him? "Oh, I'm just a little freaked out because someone keeps leaving me creepy letters warning me about invisible dangers." Yeah, that would go over well. One night, after a particularly bad day at work, I came home to find another letter. This one wasn't in the mailbox or taped to my door. It was on my bed, inside my locked house. My blood ran cold as I picked it up with trembling hands. "You're running out of time." I dropped the letter like it burned me. How had they gotten in? My mind was racing with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. I called the police, but they didn't take me seriously. No sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing. They suggested it was just a prank, maybe from someone who knew me. I stopped sleeping altogether. Every night, I sat in my living room, clutching a baseball bat, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. Just the silence, pressing in around me, suffocating me. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. And then, just as suddenly as they started, the letters stopped. For a week, I found no cryptic messages, no warnings. It should have made me feel relieved, but it only made me more paranoid. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the danger they'd been warning me about to finally show itself. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I never saw anyone. It was like there were eyes on me from the shadows, hiding just out of sight. Then one night, I woke up to a strange noise. It was coming from the bathroom. My heart was pounding as I grabbed the bat and crept down the hallway. The bathroom door was open and the light was flickering. I swallowed hard, pushing down the fear that was threatening to choke me, and stepped inside. The mirror above the sink was fogged up, like someone had just taken a hot shower. But I hadn't. I reached out, hesitating, then wiped the glass with my hand. There, scrawled in the steam, were two words that made my blood run cold. Too late. I stumbled back, dropping the bat with a clatter. My mind was screaming at me to run, but I was frozen, staring at those words. And then I saw it, my reflection. It wasn't right. The face looking back at me was mine, but the eyes were empty, hollow. It smiled, a slow, twisted grin that I hadn't made. I screamed, stumbling out of the bathroom, and ran to the front door. I had to get out, get away. But as I reached for the handle, I felt it, a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. I turned, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one, just the empty hallway behind me. I bolted, throwing open the door and running out into the night. I didn't stop until I reached Emily's house, pounding on her door like a madwoman. She opened it, eyes wide with shock, as she took in my disheveled state. "Sophie, what the hell?" I saw it, I gasped, shivering even though it wasn't cold. I saw it, Emily, in the mirror. "It's here." She pulled me inside, made me sit down. "Calm down. What are you talking about?" I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out right. I was babbling, crying, terrified out of my mind. She made me tea, sat with me until I stopped shaking, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She thought I was losing it, and maybe I was. For the next few days, I stayed with Emily. She tried to keep me calm, tried to convince me it was all in my head, but I knew better. I could feel it, whatever it was, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting. Then, one evening, I found another letter. This time, it was slipped under Emily's door. My hands were trembling so hard I could barely open it. "Now you see." I dropped the letter, my heart thudding so loudly I thought it would burst out of my chest. Emily picked it up, her face pale. "Sophie, what is this?" "It's here," I whispered. "It's been here all along." She didn't believe me, not really. But she couldn't deny the fear in my eyes, the way I jumped at every little sound. She decided to drive me back to my house, to prove there was nothing there. I didn't want to go, but she insisted. When we got there, everything was quiet, too quiet. The house felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting. Emily went in first, calling out, "See? There's nothing here, Sophie." But I knew better. I could feel it. The air was thick with it, the presence that had been haunting me, watching me. I followed her inside, my heart in my throat. And that's when I saw it. Standing in the corner of the living room, just out of the light, was a figure. I couldn't make out its features, but I knew it was watching me. I pointed, my voice barely a whisper. "Emily." She turned, but she didn't see it. She couldn't. "There's nothing there, Sophie. You're imagining things." "No," I whispered, backing away. "It's right there. It's been here all along." She shook her head, coming closer, trying to comfort me. But as she did, the figure moved. It glided out of the shadows, and I saw its face. My face. Twisted, hollow, the eyes empty and black. I screamed, stumbling back, but Emily didn't move. She was staring at me, her eyes wide with fear. "Sophie, what's happening?" "It's me." I sobbed. "But it's not me. It's..." The thing smiled, a slow, sinister grin, and then it spoke. Its voice was mine, but warped, distorted. Too late. And then it lunged. The last thing I remember was Emily's scream, mingling with my own, as the world went dark. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. Emily was sitting beside me, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "You're okay," she whispered, but there was fear in her eyes. "You're safe." But I knew better. I could feel it, lurking in the corners of the room, watching, waiting. I don't know what it is, or why it chose me. But I know it's not over. The letters warned me, but I didn't listen. And now it's too late. Because the thing in the shadows, the thing wearing my face, it's still out there. And one day it's going to come back. And this time I won't be able to escape. I've been working construction for almost 15 years now. I've seen it all: broken tools, harsh weather, and even a few close calls with heavy machinery. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened when we started digging the foundation for the new apartment building on Maple Street. It was supposed to be a straightforward job. We'd clear the land, dig out the foundation, pour the concrete, and move on to the next project. Easy enough, right? But things took a turn on the third day. I was operating the backhoe, just like any other day, when I felt the machine hit something solid. It wasn't a rock. I knew that much from the way it gave a little before stopping completely. Curious, I climbed down to take a look. That's when I saw it. A long, pale bone sticking out of the dirt. My heart skipped a beat. Now, I've heard stories about construction workers uncovering old artifacts or even bones, but it's never happened to me. I called over my supervisor, Jeff, who took one look and swore under his breath. "We gotta call this in," he muttered, pulling out his phone. The police arrived within the hour, and soon the site was swarming with people. They taped off the area and brought in some folks from the local historical society. It didn't take long for them to confirm that we'd found an entire skeleton buried right where the building's foundation was supposed to go. The bones looked ancient, brittle, and yellowed with age. They said they'd have to investigate further to see if it was part of some historical burial ground or something more sinister. Great, I thought, there goes our schedule. We were told to halt work for a few days while they sorted things out. The team was annoyed, of course, but we understood. I mean, it's not every day you dig up a set of human remains. We all hoped it was just some old grave and that we could get back to work soon. Little did I know, that was only the beginning. That night, I couldn't shake the image of those bones from my mind. I found myself tossing and turning, unable to sleep. Around midnight, I decided to take a drive, hoping it would clear my head. For some reason, my car seemed to steer itself toward the construction site. I wasn't even sure why I was going there, but something compelled me. I parked a little way down the road and walked over. The place was eerily quiet. The machinery was all covered up, and the area was still taped off. As I stood there, looking at the dark, empty lot, a chill ran down my spine. That's when I saw it, standing right where we'd uncovered the bones. A figure. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but as I squinted, I could see it more clearly. It looked like a person, just standing there, motionless. They were wearing something that looked like old, tattered clothes, barely more than rags. Their head was bowed, and their arms hung limply at their sides. "Hey," I called out, taking a step closer. "What are you doing here?" The figure didn't move, didn't react at all. It was as if they hadn't heard me. I hesitated. I didn't want to get any closer, but I felt this weird, nagging pull like I had to. I took a few more steps, and that's when it looked up. I'll never forget that face. Pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. The mouth was twisted into a kind of silent scream, like they were trapped in some eternal agony. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct told me to run. But my feet were frozen to the ground. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. Then, in the blink of an eye, the figure disappeared. Just like that, it was gone, leaving me standing there, my breath fogging up the cold night air. I stumbled back to my car and drove home, hands shaking the entire way. I tried to convince myself it was just stress, that my mind was playing tricks on me after the shock of finding those bones. But the next night, it happened again. And the night after that. Every night, I'd find myself drawn to the site, and every night, I'd see the same figure standing there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. It got to the point where I was too afraid to sleep, knowing I'd wake up in the middle of the night with this uncontrollable urge to go back. I told Jeff about it one morning, hoping he'd have some explanation, maybe even laugh it off. But instead, his face turned as white as a sheet. "You've seen it too," he whispered. Turns out, a couple of the other guys had seen it as well. They hadn't said anything because, well, who'd believe a bunch of construction workers claiming to see ghosts? But there it was, a shadowy figure haunting the site where we dug up those bones. We tried to get back to work, but things started going wrong. Equipment would break down for no reason, and we'd hear strange noises, like someone whispering just out of earshot. One guy swore he felt a cold hand on his shoulder when no one was around. Another saw shadows moving out of the corner of his eye, only to turn and find nothing there. It got so bad that a few of the crew just quit. They didn't even bother collecting their last paycheck. They just packed up and left, saying they couldn't deal with it anymore. But I stayed. I don't know why. Maybe I was just too stubborn to give in, or maybe part of me needed to know what was happening. Whatever the reason, I stuck it out. One night, after another long sleepless day, I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the site, determined to face whatever it was head on. I know it sounds crazy, but I felt like I had to do something. When I got there, the figure was already waiting for me. It was standing in the exact same spot, as still and silent as ever. I took a deep breath and walked right up to it. "What do you want?" I shouted, the words echoing in the empty lot. "Why are you here?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the figure slowly raised its arm and pointed down at the ground. I looked, and my heart nearly stopped. There, half buried in the dirt, was a small wooden box. I hadn't seen it before, and it definitely wasn't there when we'd uncovered the bones. My hands were shaking as I knelt down and brushed the dirt away. The box was old, covered in strange carvings that I couldn't make out in the dim light. I hesitated then, with a deep breath, pried it open. Inside was a bundle of letters, yellowed with age. I picked one up and unfolded it, my eyes scanning the faded handwriting. It was a love letter, written from a woman named Eleanor to someone named Thomas. The dates on the letters were from the early 1800s, and as I read through them, a picture began to form. Eleanor and Thomas had been in love, but their relationship was forbidden. They'd planned to run away together, but something had gone horribly wrong. The last letter was a desperate plea from Eleanor, begging Thomas to come back, saying she was scared for her life. I looked up at the figure, who was still watching me with those hollow eyes. "Is this you?" I whispered. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. But I knew. Somehow, I knew that this was Eleanor, trapped here, waiting for someone to find her letters, to know her story. I don't know what possessed me, but I gathered up the letters and took them to the local historical society the next day. I told them what I'd found, leaving out the part about the ghostly figure. They were fascinated, promising to look into the story and find out what had happened to Eleanor and Thomas. For a few nights after that, I didn't see the figure. I thought maybe I'd done the right thing, maybe she was finally at peace. But I was wrong. The dream started soon after. I'd see flashes of a dark forest of Eleanor running, her face twisted in fear. I'd hear her screams, feel her terror. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, one night, I saw him. Thomas. He was standing at the edge of the site, his eyes burning with an anger that sent chills down my spine. He was looking for her, and he knew I'd found the letters. I could feel his rage, his jealousy, like a physical force. The next morning, I went back to the Historical Society, hoping they'd found something, anything that could explain what was happening. But when I got there, the place was in chaos. The letters were gone. Someone had broken in and stolen them, leaving behind a mess of papers and broken glass. I knew in my gut that it had been Thomas. He didn't want the truth to come out, didn't want anyone to know what he'd done. That night, I went back to the site, hoping to see Eleanor to warn her somehow, but instead I saw him. Thomas, standing there, his eyes locked on mine. I felt a cold wind whip around me, and the world seemed to tilt and spin. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. He was coming for me. I woke up in the hospital the next day, my body bruised and battered. They told me I'd been found at the site, unconscious and alone. No one could explain what had happened, and I didn't have the strength to tell them. I quit the job after that, moved away far away, hoping to leave it all behind. But I can't escape it. Every night, I see them in my dreams. Eleanor running through the dark forest, her screams echoing in the night. And Thomas, always watching, always waiting, his eyes burning with that terrible anger. I don't know what happened to Eleanor, and I'm not sure I want to know. But I do know one thing, whatever it was, it's not over. And I'm afraid it never will be. Because sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that dark, empty lot. And I know, deep down, that they're still there waiting. I never thought I'd be afraid of light. Darkness, sure. Shadows that lurk and slink around at night, making everything seem sinister and out of place. But light was supposed to be safe. That was before I started noticing the thing that moved whenever I turned one on. It began a couple of weeks ago, just after my parents left for their trip. They were going on one of those couples retreats that they thought would somehow fix their problems. I didn't mind having the house to myself, though. I was used to being alone. My folks were hardly around anyway. It was the first night when it all started. I remember it clearly because it was a particularly stormy evening. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain hammered against the windows, the sound unnervingly loud in the empty house. I was in the living room, playing some game on my phone when the power went out. Great, I muttered to myself. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stumbled my way upstairs to the breaker box. It took a couple of tries, but the power flickered back on. I breathed a sigh of relief and turned to head back down, but something caught my eye. It was just a flicker, something darting out of sight as the lights came on. My heart jumped a little, and I paused. I turned the lights off and then on again, just to be sure I wasn't imagining things. The same thing happened. Something moved in the corner of my eye, quick and subtle, just beyond my line of vision. "What the?" I whispered, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. I switched the light off and on again, my eyes straining to catch whatever it was. But it was always just out of reach, slipping into the shadows as if it knew I was looking for it. I shook my head, chalking it up to my imagination. It had to be a trick of the light, maybe some reflection or something. I tried to forget about it, but the uneasy feeling lingered, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The next few days were uneventful, at least as far as the lights were concerned. I didn't see anything weird, and I started convincing myself that I had just been jumpy because of the storm. But then it happened again. I was in the kitchen making myself a sandwich when the lights started flickering. I glanced up, annoyed, and as soon as the lights stabilized, I saw it again, just a hint of movement out of the corner of my eye, something slipping into the hallway. I dropped the knife I was holding and whipped around, my heart pounding. The hallway was empty, the door to the basement slightly ajar. I took a step forward, my pulse racing in my ears. "Hello," I called out, feeling ridiculous for talking to an empty house. No answer, of course, but the air felt thick, like someone was holding their breath, waiting for me to make a move. I shook my head and tried to laugh it off. "I'm being stupid," I muttered, picking up the knife and finishing my sandwich. But after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if the house itself was watching me, the walls pressing in, the rooms echoing with a silence that wasn't entirely empty. And every time I turned on a light, I saw it, that flicker of movement, like something darting away just as the light came on. I started leaving the lights off even during the day. It was stupid, I know, but I couldn't help it. I felt safer in the dark, where I couldn't see whatever it was that kept slipping out of sight. But the house was big and old, and even in the dark, I felt its eyes on me. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I was sitting in my room, the only light coming from my phone screen. I hadn't turned on the overhead light in days, and the darkness was suffocating. I knew I was being ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the fear that if I turned on the light, I would see it again, that thing that I could never quite catch. But I had to know. I had to see what it was. So I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and reached for the light switch. I hesitated, my hand hovering in the air, my breath caught in my throat. Then, with a flick of my wrist, the room flooded with light. My heart pounded as my eyes darted around, looking for that familiar movement. There it was, a shadow, small and fast, slipping under the door. I bolted out of the room and down the stairs, my heart racing. I stopped in the living room, panting, and turned on the light. Again, just a flicker, a movement in the corner of my eye, something retreating into the kitchen. I felt a surge of anger. Whatever this thing was, it was toying with me, playing some sick game. I wasn't going to let it win. I stormed into the kitchen, flipping on a light. There it was again, a shadow slipping past me, almost brushing against me as it disappeared into the basement. "Enough," I shouted, my voice shaking. "Who's there? What do you want?" Silence. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. My hands were trembling as I reached for the basement door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. I didn't want to go down there, but I knew I had to. I opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. I reached for the light switch and flipped it on. The bare bulb at the bottom of the stairs flickered on, casting long, twisted shadows against the walls. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the first stair, then another. The basement was cold, the air thick and stale. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I descended, each step echoing like a drumbeat. When I reached the bottom, I froze. The basement was empty, the light swinging slightly as if someone had just brushed past it. I looked around, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. "Show yourself," I demanded, my voice breaking. "Stop hiding." And then I saw it. It was in the far corner, hunched and twisted, a mass of darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it. My breath caught in my throat as it slowly turned, revealing a face, or what should have been a face. It was featureless, just a blank, smooth surface, like a mannequin's head. My heart pounded in my chest as it started to move toward me, its limbs long and thin, its body contorting unnaturally as it crept closer. I stumbled back, my legs shaking, and reached for the light switch. I hesitated. If I turned off the light, would it disappear? Or would it follow me into the dark? My hand trembled as I reached for the switch, my eyes locked on the thing that was slowly creeping closer, its body stretching and bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Then, with a surge of courage, or maybe just desperation, I flipped the switch. Darkness swallowed the basement, and I held my breath, my heart racing in my ears. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the darkness pressing in around me. Then I heard it, a soft, slithering sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the lock, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it on the other side, scratching at the door, the sound sending shivers down my spine. I stumbled back, my eyes wide, my heart racing. The house was silent again, but I could feel it. Whatever that thing was, it was still there, waiting in the darkness, just beyond the door. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch in the living room, every light in the house turned on, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. I knew it was still there, somewhere in the house, lurking in the darkness, waiting for me to turn off the lights. When the sun finally rose, I felt a small sense of relief. The daylight made the house feel safer, less threatening. But I knew I couldn't stay. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. But as I reached for the doorknob, something made me stop. I glanced back, my eyes scanning the living room. It was empty, just like I'd left it. But something felt off, like I was being watched. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The sunlight flooded in, and I felt a rush of relief. I stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind me, and started down the driveway. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I knew if I did, I would see it. Whatever that thing was, it would be watching me from the window, its featureless face pressed against the glass, waiting for me to come back. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that house, from the thing that had been stalking me in the shadows, always just out of sight. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped. The light switch in the car caught my eye, and for a moment, I hesitated. My hand trembled as I reached for it, my heart racing. I turned it on, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, just a flicker, a hint of movement in the rearview mirror. My heart sank. It had followed me. And I knew, deep down, that I would never be alone again. I woke up suddenly, a sense of unease gripping me. The room was dark, the kind of darkness that felt thick and suffocating. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but as I glanced at the screen, something strange caught my eye. It was 3:15 a.m., the same time I usually woke up, but this time it felt different. Off. I sat up and looked around the room. Everything seemed in place, but I had this nagging feeling that something was wrong. My eyes landed on the clock above my bedroom door. The second hand wasn't moving. It was stuck on 3:15. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep, and looked again, still the same. I found it strange, but didn't think much of it. Maybe the battery had died. I made a mental note to change it in the morning and stumbled out of bed. The hallway was silent, too silent. Usually there would be the hum of the refrigerator or the creak of the house settling. But tonight, there was nothing. I walked down the hall, my bare feet making soft thuds on the wooden floor. As I passed the kitchen, I noticed something else that made my heart skip a beat. The clock on the microwave. It also read 3:15. I frowned, a chill creeping up my spine. That couldn't be right. 2 clocks stopping at the exact same time. That was too much of a coincidence. I turned around, my gaze sweeping over the living room. The large wall clock, the one that never missed a beat, showed 3:15 as well. My heart started pounding faster. I knew something was wrong, something beyond a few dead batteries. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But the silence was so thick, so unnatural, that I could feel it pressing down on me. I reached for the light switch and flicked it on, but nothing happened. The bulb didn't even flicker. The power must be out, I thought, but the streetlights outside were still glowing faintly through the windows. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. This wasn't normal. None of it was. I went back to the kitchen and opened the drawer where I kept a flashlight. I fumbled with it for a second before it clicked on, casting a narrow beam of light in front of me. I shone it around, feeling slightly better with the light in my hand. The beam passed over the clock again, and I froze. The second hand had moved, just a little, but enough to make it clear that it was no longer stuck. It was now pointing to 3:16. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I hadn't heard it tick, hadn't seen it move. I backed away slowly, the beam of the flashlight trembling as my hand shook. This wasn't right. Clocks don't just start moving on their own. My breathing became ragged, and I forced myself to calm down. I took a deep breath and looked around the room, trying to ground myself. That's when I saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest, moving in the corner of the living room. My heart jumped into my throat. I pointed the flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there, just the empty room. But I knew I had seen something. It wasn't my imagination. It had been there just for a second. I clenched the flashlight tighter and took a step forward, the floor creaking under my weight. I moved the beam slowly, scanning every inch of the room, but everything was still. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I must be dreaming. That was the only explanation. I turned around, ready to go back to bed and pretend none of this had happened, when I heard a soft whisper. "Time is running out." I spun around, the flashlight beam dancing wildly across the room. There was no one there. I knew that voice hadn't been in my head. It had been real, coming from somewhere behind me. I backed up against the wall, my pulse racing, as I tried to make sense of what was happening. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer, only silence, thick and heavy, pressing down on me from all sides. I took a few deep breaths, trying to steady myself. This was just a nightmare. I would wake up soon, and everything would be back to normal. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I took a step forward, the flashlight illuminating the hallway that led back to my bedroom. I had to get out of here. Something was very, very wrong. As I moved, I heard the whisper again, closer this time. "Time is running out." I bolted for the front door, my heart pounding in my ears. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling, but it wouldn't turn. It was locked, and the key was nowhere in sight. I cursed under my breath, my mind racing. I had to find the key, had to get out of here. I turned around, the flashlight beam sweeping across the room again. That's when I saw them. Shadows, darker than the rest, moving slowly toward me. They were shifting and swirling, as if they were alive. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table and falling to the floor. The flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled away, the beam flickering and dying. I was plunged into darkness, the only sound my ragged breathing. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes wide, straining to see in the inky blackness. Then I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the darkness and the oppressive silence. I could feel them though, the shadows closing in on me. I backed up until I hit the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. "Time is running out," the voice whispered again, right next to my ear. I screamed, the sound echoing through the empty house. I had to get out. I turned and ran down the hall, my bare feet slipping on the wooden floor. I burst into my bedroom and slammed the door behind me, leaning against it as if that could keep them out. I looked around frantically, trying to think of what to do. My eyes landed on the window. It was my only chance. I ran over and tried to open it, but it was stuck. I pulled harder, my fingers slipping on the cold glass, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. I turned around, my back to the window, as the door slowly creaked open. The shadows were there, filling the hallway, their dark forms shifting and writhing. I could feel them watching me, their presence cold and malevolent. I pressed myself against the window, my heart pounding in my ears. They were getting closer, the room growing colder with each passing second. I closed my eyes, my breath coming in short gasps, and whispered a desperate prayer. Then the whisper came again, so close that I could feel the cold breath on my skin. "Time is up." I opened my eyes, and they were there, right in front of me. The shadows, no longer just shadows. They had form now, twisted and horrifying, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. They reached for me, their cold hands closing around my arms, pulling me away from the window. I struggled, but it was like fighting against the wind. I was being dragged down into the darkness. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the clock on the wall. It was moving again, the second hand ticking steadily forward. But the time wasn't 3:15 anymore. It was midnight. And then everything went silent. I don't know how long I was in the darkness. It felt like an eternity, like I was falling through an endless void. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was fall, the darkness closing in around me, suffocating me. When I finally opened my eyes, I was back in my house. Everything was the same, but different. It felt wrong. I stood up, my legs shaky, and looked around. The clocks were all moving again, but they were all set to midnight. I shivered, the memory of what had happened still fresh in my mind. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. I tried the windows, but they were all stuck. Panic rose in my throat as I realized I was trapped, stuck in this twisted version of my own home. I ran back to my bedroom and stopped dead in my tracks. There on my bed was my own body. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I was dead. I had to be. But I was still here, still something. I looked down at my hands, but they were transparent like mist. I was a shadow just like them. "Time is up," a voice whispered, and I turned to see them, the shadows, standing in the doorway. They weren't threatening anymore. They were just there watching me. I knew then that I was one of them now, trapped in this house, forever bound to the darkness. And every night, when the clocks strike midnight, I feel it. The pull of the shadows, calling me back to the darkness, to the place where time doesn't matter, and everything is lost. I am a part of it now, a shadow in the house, and no one will ever know. Because time is up, forever. I never thought anything of it at first. After all, everyone has nightmares. But these were different. It started subtly. I'd close my eyes for a brief moment and catch a glimpse of something strange and unsettling. I shrugged it off as sleep deprivation or stress from work. I didn't pay much attention, but when the scenes became more vivid, more real, I couldn't ignore them anymore. It began last Monday. I had just gotten home from a particularly long day at the office. As I sank into the couch, I closed my eyes for a moment, just to relax. Suddenly, I was somewhere else. I was standing at the edge of a cliff, overlooking a churning black sea. The wind whipped through my hair, and I could smell the salt in the air. I took a step forward, and without any warning, I slipped. I felt the weightlessness of my body falling, the terror of the inevitable impact with the jagged rocks below. My heart raced, and just as I was about to hit the water, I snapped my eyes open. I was back on my couch, sweating and gasping for air. I laughed it off, convincing myself it was just a bizarre daydream. But it felt so real, too real. I chalked it up to fatigue and decided to get some rest. Little did I know that it was just the beginning. The next day, the scenes grew more disturbing. Every time I closed my eyes, even just to blink, I found myself in another place, experiencing another death. One time, I was in a dark, damp basement, with chains around my wrists, pulling me deeper into the shadows. Another time, I was in a burning building, flames licking at my skin, the smoke suffocating me as I screamed for help. And each time, I would open my eyes, back in my world, heart pounding and breath shallow. I stopped blinking for long periods, my eyes burning and dry. I couldn't bear it anymore. I didn't want to see what would come next. I tried to avoid sleeping, but the exhaustion always caught up. And when it did, the scenes became even worse, more detailed, more terrifying. One night, I saw myself in a hospital room. It was eerily silent. The only sound was the steady beep of the heart monitor. I looked around and realized I was the one in the bed. Tubes were attached to my body, and I felt weak, drained. Then, the beeping turned to a flat line. Panic set in, but I couldn't move. I was trapped, watching myself die, powerless to stop it. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, my body shaking. I knew I needed help. I tried to tell my best friend, Sarah, about what was happening, but she just looked at me with pity. "You've been working too hard. You need to take a break. Go see a therapist, maybe," she suggested. But how could I explain this? How could a therapist make sense of these horrifying, vivid visions that plagued me every time I closed my eyes? I tried everything I could think of: meditation, sleeping pills, alcohol. Nothing worked. The scenes kept coming, each one more gruesome than the last. And the strangest part was, they'd never repeated. Every single time I closed my eyes, I saw a new way I would die. I felt every bit of pain, every ounce of fear. It was as if something was trying to show me every possible way my life could end. But why? What did it want from me? Then last night, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I was standing in my living room, the same one I was actually in. Everything looked identical, down to the coffee cup on the table and the book I had left open on the armchair. I glanced around, confused. Then I saw myself. I was standing across the room, staring back at me. My doppelganger smiled, a twisted, chilling smile that made my stomach turn. I walked toward me, slowly, deliberately. I tried to back away, but I was rooted to the spot. She reached out, a hand touching my face, cold as ice. Then, with a swift motion, she plunged a knife into my chest. I gasped, feeling the sharp pain, the warmth of blood soaking through my shirt. I looked into her eyes, and saw nothing but darkness. I jolted awake, my hand clutching my chest where the knife had been. There was no wound, but the pain lingered. A ghostly reminder of what I had just experienced. That was when I knew it wasn't just a nightmare, it was a warning. I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer. I packed a bag, not knowing where I was going, only that I needed to get away. But as I grabbed my keys, I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to close my eyes. My body was exhausted, and it was like something was pulling me under. I fought it, but I was too weak. My eyelids fluttered shut. This time, I was in a car, driving down a dark, deserted road. The headlights cut through the inky blackness, but the road seemed to stretch on forever. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a figure sitting in the backseat. My heart stopped. It was her, the other me. She was grinning that same terrible grin, her eyes locked onto mine through the mirror. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice cold and mocking. "I don't know," I whispered, fear gripping me. "I don't know." She leaned forward, her breath hot against my ear. "You can't run from me. I'm always with you." I woke up with a start, still holding my keys. I knew then that there was no escape. Whatever this was, it was inside me. It was me. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified to close my eyes, to sleep, to even blink. The exhaustion was overwhelming. I could feel it pulling me down, but I was too scared to let go. I tried staying awake, gulping down coffee after coffee, but my body was shutting down. I could feel it. And then I heard a voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, but it filled the room. "Close your eyes," it said. "No," I whispered back, shaking my head violently. "I won't." "Close your eyes," it repeated, more insistent this time. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the voice, but it was no use. It was everywhere, inside my head, echoing through my skull. "Close your eyes and it will all be over." I was shaking, tears streaming down my face. I was so tired. I just wanted it to stop. I wanted to sleep, to not be afraid anymore. Slowly, reluctantly, I let my eyelids fall. This time, I was back in my apartment. Everything looked normal, eerily so. I glanced around, my heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. Then, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw her, standing in the doorway, her eyes cold and dark. "You finally gave in," she said, her voice laced with satisfaction. "What do you want from me?" I cried, my voice breaking. She smiled, that same twisted smile. "I want you to see." "See what?" "Your end." Before I could react, she lunged at me. Her hands closed around my throat, squeezing, crushing. I gasped, struggling to breathe, to fight back, but she was too strong. I felt the darkness closing in, and with it, a strange, almost peaceful calm. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was what I had been fighting all along, my own inevitable end. And now that it was here, I was too tired to resist. As my vision faded, I saw her face close to mine, her eyes boring into me. "You can't escape me," she whispered, her voice echoing in the darkness. "I am you." And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor, my head throbbing. I took a deep breath, my hand instinctively reaching for my throat. There were no marks, no bruises, but I could still feel the phantom pain of her grip. I looked around, expecting to seek her, but I was alone. Slowly, I got to my feet, every muscle in my body aching. I stumbled to the bathroom, needing to see my reflection, to prove to myself that I was still here, still me. But when I looked in the mirror, I froze. The face staring back at me was mine, but it wasn't. Her eyes were empty, hollow, and that smile. God, that smile. "Hello," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "Did you miss me?" I stumbled back, my heart racing. I blinked, and she was gone. It was just me, my own terrified face staring back from the glass. But I knew she was still there, lurking, waiting. I don't know how much longer I can do this. I'm afraid to sleep, afraid to close my eyes, even for a second. Because I know she's there, waiting to show me another death, another ending. And one day, I'm not sure if I'll be able to open my eyes again. When my wife, Sarah, and I bought the small cottage at the edge of town, we thought we'd found the perfect escape. The property backed onto a dense forest, and we loved the idea of being surrounded by nature. It was peaceful, quiet, and a far cry from the city life we were trying to leave behind. The first few weeks were blissful. We spent our days fixing up the house and our evenings sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the trees. The woods were enchanting, almost calling to us, and every time we looked out at them, we felt a strange sense of calm. But that feeling didn't last long. One evening after dinner, Sarah suggested we go for a walk in the woods. It was a warm night, the kind that made you feel like summer would last forever. We grabbed a couple of flashlights and headed into the forest, following a narrow path we had discovered earlier that week. As we walked deeper into the woods, the air seemed to thicken. The sounds of crickets and rustling leaves began to fade, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. I tried to shake it off, thinking I was just being paranoid, but then I heard it, a faint whisper. "Did you hear that?" I asked, stopping in my tracks. "Hear what?" Sarah replied, shining her flashlight around. "I don't know, it sounded like someone whispering." She gave me a puzzled look, but then shrugged. Probably just the wind. We continued walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The whispers started again, low and unintelligible, like a voice carried on the breeze. I glanced at Sarah and saw that she was starting to look uneasy too. "Maybe we should head back," she suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, relieved that she felt it too. We turned around and walked quickly back to the house, neither of us saying a word until we were safely inside. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," I admitted, my heart still pounding in my chest. "Maybe the wind, or something." We tried to brush it off as our imaginations playing tricks on us, but neither of us could sleep that night. I kept hearing the whispers echoing in my head, and every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was standing at the foot of the bed, watching us. The next day, we avoided the woods altogether. We busied ourselves with house chores and pretended like nothing had happened. But that evening, as we sat on the porch, we both found ourselves staring at the tree line, wondering if we had really heard what we thought we did. A few nights later, curiosity got the better of us. We decided to go back into the woods, convinced that we had just spooked ourselves the first time. This time, we went during the day, hoping the sunlight would make everything seem less sinister. It didn't. The whispers started as soon as we crossed the threshold into the forest. They were faint at first, almost like a gentle hum, but they grew louder with every step we took. I glanced at Sarah and saw that she was pale, her eyes darting around as if trying to pinpoint where the voices were coming from. "Let's just turn back," I suggested, my voice trembling. But Sarah shook her head. "No, I want to know what it is." I didn't want to go any further, but I couldn't leave her alone, so we pressed on. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they weren't just random noises. They were saying something. "Turn back. Go away." I felt a chill run down my spine as the words registered. Sarah heard them too because she grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "Did you get that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, let's go." We practically ran out of the woods, not stopping until we were back in the safety of our home. We locked the doors and windows, as if that could keep out whatever was in those woods. That night, we barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispers, closer now, like they were right outside the window. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. The next morning, we decided to do some research. We went to the local library and asked about the history of the woods. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, looked at us strangely when we mentioned where we lived. "You're staying near Blackwood Forest?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "Yes, why?" I asked, leaning forward. She sighed and glanced around, as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "That place has a dark history. There have been stories of people hearing voices, seeing things that shouldn't be there. They say the woods are cursed." "Cursed?" Sarah repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. The librarian nodded. "It's been that way for generations. People who go too far into the woods, they don't come back the same. Some don't come back at all." We left the library more confused and scared than before. On the way home, we tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just local superstition, old stories passed down to scare kids into staying out of the woods. But deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. Over the next few days, the whispers got worse. We didn't have to be in the woods to hear them anymore. They were everywhere, in the house, in the yard, even in our dreams. It was like the forest was closing in on us, suffocating us with its presence. One night, I woke up to find Sarah standing by the window, staring out at the woods. Her eyes were glassy, and she was mumbling something under her breath. "Sarah?" I called softly, afraid to startle her. She didn't respond, just kept staring, her lips moving rapidly. I got out of bed and gently touched her arm, and she turned to look at me, her eyes wide with fear. "They're calling me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who's calling you?" I asked, feeling a knot of fear tighten in my stomach. "The voices. They want me to come to them." I felt a surge of panic. "No, Sarah, you're just dreaming. Come back to bed." But she shook her head. "You don't understand. They're in my head. They won't stop." I led her back to bed, but she didn't sleep. She just lay there, staring at the ceiling, her eyes wide and unblinking. I stayed awake all night, watching her, afraid of what she might do if I looked away. The next day, I decided we needed to leave. I didn't care about the house, the woods, any of it. I just wanted to get Sarah away from whatever was happening. But she refused. "I can't leave," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They won't let me." "Who won't let you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The voices. They'll follow us." I didn't know what to do. I felt helpless, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. That night, the whispers were louder than ever, and I realized they weren't just whispering anymore. They were laughing. The sound was chilling, echoing through the house like a dark melody. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The laughter seeped into my mind, filling me with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. Sarah was worse. She barely spoke, barely ate. She just stared out at the woods, her eyes empty, as if something had taken hold of her. I tried everything to snap her out of it, but nothing worked. Then, one night, I woke up to find her gone. Panic surged through me as I realized the front door was open. I ran outside, my heart pounding, and saw her walking toward the woods, her movements slow and deliberate. "Sarah," I shouted, running after her. But she didn't stop. She didn't even turn around. She just kept walking, the whispers growing louder with every step. I caught up to her at the edge of the forest, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. "No, Sarah, we have to go back. Please." She looked at me then, and I'll never forget the look in her eyes. It was like she didn't recognize me, like she was staring right through me. "I have to go," she said softly, her voice blending with the whispers. "They're waiting for me." "No, you don't. We can leave. We can get help." But she just shook her head. "It's too late." And before I could stop her, she turned and walked into the woods. I tried to follow, but the moment I stepped into the forest, the air grew heavy, almost suffocating. The whispers surrounded me, closing in like a swarm of locusts. I called out to her, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. I don't know how long I wandered, calling her name, trying to find my way out. The trees seemed to close in around me, the path disappearing beneath my feet. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the whispers stopped. I was alone, standing in a small clearing. The air was still, the silence deafening. And in the middle of the clearing, there was a small mound of earth, freshly dug. My heart sank as I realized what it was. A grave. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face as I clawed at the earth, desperate to find her. But the ground was hard, unyielding, and no matter how much I dug, I couldn't get through. And then I heard it, the faintest of whispers, drifting on the wind. "Too late, too late." I stumbled back, my mind reeling, as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The trees twisted and turned, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath me shifted, and I realized with a sickening jolt that I wasn't standing on solid ground anymore. I was standing on bodies. They were everywhere, half buried in the earth, their eyes staring up at me, mouths open in silent screams. And in the center of it all, standing over the grave, was Sarah. But it wasn't her. Her eyes were empty, her skin pale and lifeless. She looked at me, her mouth twisting into a cruel smile. "Too late," she whispered, her voice echoing around me. "You can't leave." I tried to run, but the ground shifted beneath me, pulling me down, wrapping around my ankles like a vice. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Sarah, her eyes glowing in the darkness, her smile widening as she reached out for me. and then the whispers took me. I don't know how long I've been here, trapped in the darkness, listening to the whispers. Time doesn't mean anything anymore. I can't see, can't move, can't even scream, but I can hear them. They're all around me, whispering, laughing, waiting. And now, as I feel myself fading, I understand. I'm not alone. I'm one of them now, lost in the darkness, forever bound to this cursed place. And if you ever find yourself near Blackwood Forest, remember this. Don't listen to the whispers, because once you hear them, it's already too late. I've been the head librarian at Preston Public Library for almost a decade now. It's not a big library, just a cozy place nestled in the corner of our small town. It's the kind of place where people come not just for books, but for a quiet escape from their daily lives. Over the years, I've seen my fair share of odd things, strange patrons, misplaced books, the usual quirks of running an old library. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened last autumn. It started on a Wednesday. I remember because it was the day our new volunteer, Sarah, began helping with the returns. I was in my office, going through some paperwork, when she rushed in, looking pale as a ghost. "Mr. Blackwood, I think you need to see this," she said, holding up a stack of books. I followed her to the returns desk, where she laid out the books one by one. They were old, much older than any book we had in circulation. The covers were worn, the pages yellowed, and the smell of musty paper filled the air. But what caught my eye were the names scribbled on the inside covers in faded ink. John Milton, 1952. I read aloud from the first book. Mary Thompson, 1961, from the second, and the list went on. Each book had a name and a year written inside, and what struck me as odd was that none of these books had our library stamp. "I've never seen these books before," I said, frowning. "That's not all," Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. I looked up the names in the town records. They're all people who disappeared, vanished without a trace, and not just recently, Mr. Blackwood. We're talking 50, 60 years ago. I felt a chill run down my spine. Our town had its fair share of ghost stories, but I'd always brushed them off as folklore, tales told to keep kids out of trouble. This felt different. I decided to keep the books in my office, away from prying eyes, and started digging into the town archives. For the next few days, I barely left the library. I sifted through old newspapers, town records, anything I could get my hands on. And the more I read, the more unsettling it became. Each name in those books was linked to a disappearance. All of them were last seen heading towards the library, but none of them were ever seen leaving. The thought of it made my skin crawl. I started wondering if there was something hidden in the library, some dark secret buried in its history. I'd heard rumors before, whispers of a hidden room, of books that could never be found. But I always thought they were just that, rumors. One night, as I sat alone in my office, a cold wind blew through the open window, sending papers flying off my desk. I got up to close it when I heard a faint thud from the returns desk. I glanced over, and there it was, another old book, lying on the counter as if someone had just placed it there. I walked over and picked it up, my heart pounding in my chest. The cover was dark and faded, with no title. I opened it slowly, my hands trembling. Inside was a name I didn't recognize. Eleanor Jenkins, 1937. The year was older than any of the others. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Who was bringing these books back? And why now? I spent the next day trying to track down anything on Eleanor Jenkins. But there was nothing, no records, no family, no mention of her in any of the old newspapers. It was as if she had never existed. By then, I was convinced that something or someone was trying to tell me something, but I had no idea what. That evening, as I was locking up, I noticed something odd. One of the shelves in the history section was slightly ajar, as if someone had moved it. I knew that section like the back of my hand, and I was sure it had been flush against the wall earlier. I walked over and tried to push it back into place, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I saw it, a narrow gap behind the shelf, barely visible in the dim light. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and peered into the gap. It was just wide enough to squeeze through. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the shelf aside, revealing a hidden passageway, dusty and dark. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. The passage was narrow and winding, the air thick with dust and the smell of old paper. I followed it for what felt like an eternity until I reached a small, hidden room. My flashlight beam danced across the walls, lined with shelves full of books, but these weren't ordinary books. Each one was old and worn, just like the ones returned to the desk. And inside, each had a name written in the same faded ink. I felt a shiver run down my spine. What was this place? Why were these books hidden away? And then I noticed something else. There were empty spots on the shelves, as if some books were missing. My mind raced. Those were the books that had been returned, the ones with the names of the vanished. As I stood there, staring at the shelves, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I wanted to leave, to get out of that dark, claustrophobic space, but something stopped me. I turned around and saw, on a small wooden table in the corner, a stack of papers. I walked over, my hands trembling, and picked them up. They were old library records, but not from our library. The dates went back almost a century, and on each page was a list of names, people who had borrowed books from this hidden collection. My eyes scanned the lists until I found what I was looking for. Eleanor Jenkins, borrowed in 1937, never returned. I felt a chill run down my spine. Was that what this was about? The books weren't just being returned, they were being claimed. But by whom? And why now? I stumbled back, desperate to get out of there, when I noticed one more thing. On the last page of the records, at the bottom of the list, was a name I recognized, Jonathan Blackwood, 2022. I dropped the papers, my heart hammering in my chest. That was my name, and today's date. I felt like the walls were closing in on me. I ran out of the room, down the passage, and back into the main library. I shoved the shelf back into place and collapsed against it, gasping for breath. For a moment, I just sat there, trying to make sense of it all. My name was on that list, but I hadn't borrowed anything. Had I? I racked my brain, but I couldn't remember. And then it hit me, the books, the ones returned to the desk. I hadn't borrowed them, but I'd taken them. Taken them into my office, kept them close. Was that what it meant? I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the hidden room, the names in the books, and my own name on that list. I knew I should have told someone, but who would believe me? I barely believed it myself, so I did nothing. I locked the books away and tried to forget about it. But it didn't forget about me. A week later, another book appeared on the returns desk. This one was different. The cover was pristine, as if it had never been touched. And inside, in the same faded ink, was my name, Jonathan Blackwood, 2022. I stared at it, my hands shaking. There was no date, no time, just my name. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I didn't know what to do. I thought about burning it, getting rid of it somehow, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I took it home and locked it in a drawer, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The next morning, I found the drawer open, the book lying on my bed. I knew then that it wasn't going to let me go. I felt trapped, like a character in one of those old ghost stories, doomed to repeat the same mistakes. I went back to the library, to the hidden room, hoping to find some answers. But when I pushed the shelf aside, the passage was gone. Just a solid wall, as if it had never been there. I felt a sense of despair wash over me. I knew then that I was trapped, caught in some kind of twisted game, and I didn't know the rules. That night, I sat in my office, staring at the book with my name on it. I don't know how long I sat there, but at some point, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, the book was gone. I searched everywhere, but it was like it had vanished into thin air. I felt a sense of relief, thinking maybe it was over, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day, I found a note on my desk, written in that same faded ink, returned. No name, no date, just that one word. I don't know what it means. I don't know what any of this means. But I have a feeling that, whatever it is, it's not finished with me yet. And I don't think it ever will be. So, if you ever find an old book with a name written inside, think twice before you take it. You never know what kind of story you might become a part of. And if you're ever in Preston, drop by the library. I'll be here, just like always, waiting for the next book to be returned. Or maybe one day, I'll be the one returning it. I never imagined I'd find myself fascinated by an old typewriter. My name is Claire, and I'm an aspiring writer, or at least I was until life got in the way. It was on a rainy afternoon when I stumbled upon it, hidden away in the attic of the house I'd recently inherited from my grandmother. She was always a bit eccentric, collecting all sorts of odd things, but I never knew about the typewriter. Dusty and neglected, it sat alone on a wooden desk beneath a small window, the light dimly illuminating its faded keys. It had a certain aura about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. My grandmother had left a note on it, written in her familiar cursive. "Be careful what you write, dear. This machine has a mind of its own." I chuckled at first, dismissing it as another one of her quirky jokes. I hadn't written anything in months, not since my last story was rejected by every publisher I sent it to. Maybe this was a sign, a push to get back to what I loved. I decided to take the typewriter downstairs, cleaned it up, and set it on the desk in my study. The first message appeared the very next day. I woke up to find a piece of paper neatly fed through the typewriter, letters stamped onto it in uneven lines. "Don't go to the market today." I frowned, my first thought being that someone was playing a prank on me. I lived alone though, and the doors were locked. Brushing it off as a strange coincidence, I crumpled the paper and tossed it in the trash. I did need to go to the market to buy groceries, but something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the eeriness of the whole situation. I stayed home, deciding to do some cleaning instead. Around noon, I heard on the news that there had been a terrible accident at the market, a gas leak explosion that injured several people. My blood ran cold. What were the chances? Over the next few days, the typewriter continued to spit out messages. Each morning, a new warning awaited me. "Stay away from the old oak tree in the backyard. Don't answer the door tonight. Call your sister now." It was as if the typewriter was trying to protect me, guiding me away from danger. And each time I heeded its warnings, something awful happened. The oak tree in the backyard was struck by lightning during a freak storm, splitting in half. A stranger had knocked on my door late at night, and the next day I read about a series of break-ins in the neighborhood. When I called my sister, she was on the verge of a breakdown and needed someone to talk to. It was like the typewriter knew what was going to happen before I did. But how? My fear soon turned into obsession. I spent hours sitting in front of the typewriter, waiting for it to type out another message, but it only did so when I wasn't around. I tried leaving a camera on, but the screen turned to static every time the typewriter started typing on its own. It was frustrating and terrifying. I started to wonder if it was my grandmother, somehow communicating with me from beyond. But why would she do that? What was her motive? I remembered the note she left. "This machine has a mind of its own." What did she mean by that? I decided to dig deeper into the history of the typewriter. I found some old newspaper clippings hidden in the desk drawer. Apparently, the typewriter belonged to a famous writer in the 1920s who went mad and eventually took his own life. Rumor had it that the typewriter was cursed, that it drove him insane by revealing too much about the future. I should have thrown it out right then and there, but I couldn't. I was too intrigued, too entangled in its mystery. Then one day, the messages took a darker turn. "Someone close to you will betray you." It felt like a punch to the gut. I didn't have many people in my life, my sister, a few friends. Who could it be talking about? I tried to ignore the message, but paranoia crept in. I began to question everything and everyone. Every conversation felt loaded, every gesture suspect. Days passed, and the typewriter remained silent, as if it was watching, waiting. I started losing sleep, constantly on edge. I needed to know more, needed answers that weren't coming. Then finally, a new message appeared. "Find the box in the basement." I hesitated. The basement was the one place I avoided in the house. It was cold, dark, and cluttered with years of forgotten memories. But I couldn't ignore the typewriter's message. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the creaky stairs. After what felt like hours of searching through old furniture and dusty boxes, I found it, an old wooden box with intricate carvings. It looked ancient, out of place among the mundane clutter. My heart raced as I pried it open. Inside, I found letters, dozens of them, all addressed to my grandmother. Each letter was a warning, similar to the ones I was getting now. They detailed events that had happened in her life, tragedies she had avoided because of the typewriter's messages. It was clear now. The typewriter had been with her all along, guiding her, just as it was guiding me. But why had she kept it a secret? Among the letters, I found one addressed to me. It was dated the day she died. Claire, if you're reading this, it means the typewriter has chosen you. Do not trust it. It may seem like it's helping, but it has its own agenda. I tried to get rid of it, but it always found its way back. Be careful, dear. Don't let it control you. My hands trembled as I read her words. The typewriter wasn't trying to help, it was manipulating me. But for what purpose? I ran back upstairs, determined to get rid of it. I grabbed the typewriter, intending to throw it out, but it was heavier than before, almost as if it was resisting me. I was about to smash it when the keys started moving violently. A new message appeared, the letters hammered into the paper with a force I'd never seen before. You can't escape. You're mine now. I dropped the typewriter in horror, backing away. The lights flickered, and a chill filled the room. It was then that I saw it, a shadowy figure, almost human-like, standing by the door. Its presence was suffocating, malevolent. And then, the typewriter typed out one last message, each word echoing in the silent room. She's already here. I turned around to see my own reflection in the window, but it wasn't me. It was a twisted version, eyes hollow and empty. I screamed, but no sound came out. My body felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot as the shadow crept closer. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the shadow, the coldness wrapping around me like a shroud. When I finally regained control, the typewriter was gone. So was the shadow. It was as if nothing had happened, but I knew better. Something had changed. I tried to leave the house, but every door was locked, every window sealed shut. I was trapped. The typewriter's last message replayed in my mind. She's already here. I understood now. It was never warning me about external dangers. It was warning me about itself, about what it would do to me. I'm writing this now, my final message. I don't know if anyone will read it, or if it will even leave this house. The typewriter is back on the desk, waiting, watching. I can feel its presence inside me, like a dark shadow creeping through my mind, taking over. I can't fight it anymore. It's too strong. My grandmother was right. I should have listened. I don't know what will happen to me, but if you're reading this, heed my warning. Stay away from this house. Don't touch the typewriter. It's not a tool, it's a prison. And now, as I finish this last sentence, I can hear the keys clacking on their own again. One final message before it takes over completely. You're next. I remember the first call like it was yesterday. It was a rainy Tuesday evening, and I was curled up on my couch with a cup of tea, watching some mindless TV show. My phone rang, startling me. I glanced at the screen and frowned. The caller ID showed my own number. It must be some sort of glitch, I thought, but curiosity got the better of me, and I answered. Hello, I said cautiously. Listen to me very carefully. A voice that sounded exactly like mine spoke on the other end. There's going to be a car accident tomorrow at the corner of 5th and Main. Don't take that route. I was stunned. I sat there, clutching the phone, my heart racing. Was this some kind of prank? But the voice, it was undeniably mine. Who is this? I asked, my voice trembling. It's you, from the future. I know this sounds insane, but you have to believe me. Don't go there tomorrow. Promise me. I opened my mouth to speak, but the line went dead. I stared at the phone in disbelief. A shiver ran down my spine as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was it a joke? A dream? I shook my head and laughed nervously, brushing it off. I had to be losing my mind. The next morning, the call was still lingering in my mind, but I shrugged it off. I had an important meeting downtown, and the quickest route was through 5th and Main. I didn't have time to entertain bizarre thoughts. I was almost late when I hopped into my car and sped down the usual road. As I approached the intersection, my phone rang again. It was my number. I didn't answer, but I slowed down, my heart pounding. Maybe, just maybe, there was some truth to it. But traffic was heavy, and I couldn't turn back. I took a deep breath and drove through the intersection, my eyes darting around for any sign of trouble. Nothing happened. I breathed a sigh of relief and kept driving. Then I saw it in my rearview mirror. A truck barreling down the road, horn blaring, unable to stop. It smashed into the cars behind me, a terrible cacophony of metal and glass. My hands shook as I pulled over, watching the chaos unfold in the mirror. If I had been just a few seconds late, I felt sick. That call, it wasn't a joke. It saved my life. The calls didn't stop. Every few days, I'd get another one, always from myself, always with a warning. Don't go to the grocery store today. Stay home. Skip the gym this evening. Trust me. Don't pick up that package. Leave it at the door. Each time I listened. Each time I avoided what could have been a disaster. A robbery at the grocery store. A violent fight at the gym. A package that was tampered with. I was alive, unscathed, because of those calls. I tried to talk to my future self, tried to ask questions, but she never answered. It was always just warnings, urgent and insistent, and then she'd hang up. I started to rely on those calls. I stopped making plans. I waited for her instructions, trapped in my own home, waiting for danger to pass. One evening the call came again. My voice was shaking, panicked. There's a man outside your house. He's watching you. Don't go near the windows. Turn off the lights and hide. I froze, my heart slamming against my chest. I dropped to the floor, crawling to the light switch and flicking it off. My hands were trembling as I peered around the corner, careful not to be seen. There he was, a shadowy figure standing across the street, watching my house. I felt a surge of fear, battle rising in my throat. How did I know this? I stayed hidden, heart racing, until the figure finally walked away into the darkness. When he was gone, I let out a shaky breath and collapsed against the wall, tears streaming down my face. What was happening to me? Days turned into weeks, and the calls kept coming. I was on edge all the time, paranoid and jumpy. I stopped going out. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I became a prisoner in my own home, my life dictated by the voice on the other end of the line. I tried to tell people, but they looked at me like I was crazy. I couldn't blame them. I sounded crazy. My own parents suggested I see a therapist. My friends stopped calling. I was alone, isolated, with only the voice for company. And then the warnings got worse. One night, I got the call. My voice was different this time, desperate, almost pleading. He's inside. He's coming for you. Run. Run now. I felt a cold sweat break out over my body. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I crept to the front door, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might give me away. But it was too late. I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I spun around, the knife slipping from my trembling fingers. A man stood there, grinning, holding my phone. My phone. He tossed it to the side and took a step closer. I guess you didn't listen this time, he said, his voice low and mocking. I backed away, terror freezing my limbs. How did he get in? Who was he? He lunged at me, and I screamed, stumbling backward. The last thing I saw was his face twisted in a cruel smile before everything went black. I woke up in the hospital, bandages covering my wounds. My head was throbbing, and my vision was blurry. I tried to sit up, but a nurse gently pushed me back down. Take it easy, she said softly. You've been through a lot. What happened? I croaked, my voice hoarse. You were attacked, she said, her expression sympathetic. A neighbor heard the commotion and called the police. They got there just in time. I nodded numbly, my mind racing. The calls, the warnings, they had all led to this moment. I had been saved, but at what cost? A few days later, I was back home, trying to piece my life back together. I hadn't heard from her since the attack. No calls, no warnings. I felt lost without them, even though they had driven me to the brink of insanity. Then the phone rang. My heart leaped into my throat as I picked it up. It's over now, my voice whispered. You're safe, for now. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone against the wall. Instead, I whispered back, my voice shaking with rage and fear. Who are you? Why are you doing this to me? There was a long pause, and then she spoke, her voice calm and eerily familiar. You know who I am, and you know what you have to do. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my mind spinning. What did she mean? What was I supposed to do? I spent the next few days searching for answers, trying to remember every detail of the calls. There was something I was missing, some clue hidden in her words. And then it hit me. The man who attacked me, he had my phone. My phone had been hacked. Someone had been watching me, tracking me, and using my own voice to manipulate me. I felt a surge of anger and fear. I had been a pawn in someone else's sick game. But why and who? I took my phone and threw it into the trash. I changed my locks, installed security cameras, and tried to move on. But the fear lingered, a shadow over my life. Months passed, and the calls stopped. I started to feel normal again, or as normal as I could. I went back to work, tried to reconnect with friends, and pretended that everything was fine. And then, one day, my doorbell rang. I opened the door and froze. It was me, standing on my doorstep, looking exactly like I had the day this nightmare began. "Hello," she said, smiling. "I have one last warning for you." I stared at her, my heart pounding. This wasn't possible. She couldn't be real. She leaned in, her smile widening, and whispered in my ear, "You never really left the hospital." My blood ran cold. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. What was she talking about? She reached out and touched my hand, her skin cold as ice. "You've been in a coma since the attack. Everything you've seen, everything you've heard, it's all been in your head. You're still lying in that hospital bed, fighting for your life." I felt like the ground was falling away beneath me. I tried to speak, but no words came out. "And now," she said softly, "it's time to wake up." She took a step back, her smile fading. Or maybe it's time to let go. I watched as she turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I stood there, shaking, my mind torn between reality and madness. Was she telling the truth? Was everything just a dream? Or was this some final cruel trick? I closed the door and sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know what to believe anymore. I didn't know what was real. And then the phone rang. I've always loved abandoned places. There's something hauntingly beautiful about the decay, the silence, and the stories etched into crumbling walls. It's like each crack, each shattered window, tells a tale of what once was. That's why, when I got the chance to do a photo shoot in an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, I jumped at it. I thought it would be the perfect setting for a gritty, atmospheric photo series. I arrived just before dusk, hoping to catch the golden hour. The warehouse was enormous, with towering walls and broken windows that cast long, eerie shadows across the dusty floor. Rusted metal beams crisscrossed overhead, and the faint scent of mildew hung in the air. It was perfect. I started setting up my equipment, checking the light, adjusting my camera settings. As I looked through the lens, I could already see the potential for some incredible shots. The light filtering through the broken windows created a sort of ethereal glow that contrasted beautifully with the darkness of the space. I began taking pictures, one after the other, moving around the vast space to capture different angles. I didn't notice anything strange at first. I was too focused on getting the perfect shot. But as I reviewed the first batch on my camera's screen, I saw them. Shadowy figures. They were barely noticeable at first, almost like smudges or tricks of the light. But they were there. In every photo, somewhere in the background, these dark shapes lingered. They were human-like, but distorted, almost as if they were stretching or melting into the darkness around them. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off. It was probably just dust or a shadow cast by the debris. This place was full of strange shapes and patterns. It wasn't unusual for something like that to show up in a photo. I kept shooting. As the light outside dimmed, the atmosphere in the warehouse grew heavier. The shadows lengthened, and the figures in my photos became more defined. They were no longer just faint outlines. I could see details now: the curve of a shoulder, the bend of an arm, the hollow where eyes should be. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone else was in the building, a homeless person or a group of teenagers messing around. But every time I stopped and listened, there was nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the distant creak of the building settling. I was alone. At least I thought I was. I decided to explore deeper into the warehouse, hoping to get some more shots before it got too dark. The further I went, the colder it seemed to get. My footsteps echoed in the vast space, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I found a staircase leading up to what looked like an old office area. The door was hanging off its hinges, and I had to squeeze through to get inside. The room was small, filled with dusty old furniture and scattered papers. I started taking photos, focusing on the cracked windows and the peeling paint on the walls. Then I saw it. A shadow, not in my camera, but right in front of me. It moved across the room, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking. But there was no one there. My heart raced, and I felt a sudden urge to leave. But I didn't. I couldn't. I had to see if I could capture it. I raised my camera and snapped a few shots. The flash lit up the room, momentarily blinding me. When my eyes adjusted, the shadow was gone. I looked at the photos on my screen, and there it was. The same figure, clearer than ever before, standing in the corner of the room, its head tilted as if it were looking right at me. I stumbled back, my hands shaking. What the hell was I seeing? I wanted to leave, but I felt rooted to the spot, like something was holding me there. I forced myself to move, turning and practically running back down the stairs. As I made my way back to the main area of the warehouse, I kept looking around, expecting to see the shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. But I didn't see anything. I was almost at the exit when I heard it, a whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. "Don't leave." I froze. The voice was soft, almost pleading. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there, just the empty, echoing space of the warehouse. I swallowed hard and took a deep breath. It was just my imagination, I told myself. I was scaring myself. But then I heard it again, louder this time, more insistent. "Don't leave." It felt like ice water being poured down my spine. I didn't wait to hear it again. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, nearly tripping over debris in my rush to get out. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for breath in the cool night air. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing. What had I just experienced? I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, that I was tired and imagining things. But I couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure looking at me. When I got home, I hesitated before looking at the photos again. Part of me didn't want to see what I had captured, but I had to know. I plugged my camera into my computer and started scrolling through the images. They were worse than I remembered. The shadows were everywhere. In every photo, they were closer, more defined. I could see faces now, twisted and dark, their eyes empty. And in the last few shots, the ones from the office, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was me. In the background of the photos, behind the shadowy figure, I could see myself, standing in the doorway, looking terrified. But that wasn't possible. I was the one taking the photos. How could I be in them? My hands were shaking so badly I could barely move the mouse. I clicked on the last photo, the one I had taken just before I ran out. It was the clearest of them all. The shadow was standing right in front of the camera, its face inches from the lens. And behind it, I could see myself, my face pale and eyes wide with fear. I deleted the photos, every single one. But it didn't matter. I could still see them in my mind, etched into my memory. I tried to sleep that night, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those faces, those empty eyes staring at me. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. I would catch glimpses of shadows moving in my apartment, just out of the corner of my eye. I heard whispers at night, faint and unintelligible. My phone would ring, but there was never anyone on the other end. I stopped going out. I couldn't focus on anything. I kept my curtains drawn and my lights on at all hours. I knew it was irrational, but I felt like they were watching me, waiting for me to slip up to let my guard down. Then one night, I woke up to find my computer on. I was sure I had turned it off before going to bed. The screen was glowing softly in the darkness, and when I went to turn it off, I saw it. The photos, they were back. Every single one, open on my screen. I stared at them, my heart pounding. How was this possible? I had deleted them, but there they were, as clear as day. And as I watched, they started to change. The shadows moved. Slowly at first, then faster, shifting and swirling on the screen. The figures turned to face me, their eyes locking onto mine. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The last photo changed, the one with me in the background. The shadowy figure stepped aside, revealing my terrified face. But then I saw something else. Another shadow moving behind me in the photo, reaching out. I turned around, my blood running cold. There was nothing there, just the empty room, but I could feel it. The air was thick, heavy. I wasn't alone. I spun back to the computer and the photos were gone. The screen was blank. I grabbed my phone and called a friend, someone I hadn't talked to in years. I didn't know who else to call. I needed to hear a familiar voice, something to ground me. They answered, groggy and confused. I tried to explain, but I could barely form the words. I sounded crazy, I knew I did. But they listened, at least for a while. They told me I should get out of the apartment, go stay with someone. I nodded, even though they couldn't see me. I hung up and started packing a bag. I didn't care where I went, I just needed to get out. But as I turned to leave, I felt it again. That cold, creeping sensation. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. There, in the corner of the room, was a shadow. Darker than the rest of the room, almost solid. It shifted, and I heard it. The whisper, "Don't leave." I froze, my hand on the doorknob. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay, but I was terrified to move. The shadow seemed to swell, growing larger, darker. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I took a step back, and the whisper grew louder, "Don't leave." I ran. I don't know how I made it down the stairs without falling, but I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air. I didn't look back. I got in my car and drove, not knowing where I was going, just trying to get away. I ended up at a hotel on the edge of town. I paid for a room in cash and locked myself inside. I sat on the bed, my back against the wall, staring at the door. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep for a long time after that. It's been weeks now. I haven't gone back to the apartment. I'm not sure I ever will. I tried to forget, to convince myself it was all in my head. But I know it wasn't. They're still with me. I see them in reflections, in the shadows of dark corners. I hear the whispers when I'm alone. I don't know what they want, but I know they're not going to leave me alone. I made a mistake that day at the warehouse. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, captured something I shouldn't have. And now, no matter where I go, they follow. I don't know how this ends. I don't think it does. All I can do is keep moving, keep running. But I'm getting tired. And sometimes, when the shadows grow long and the whispers grow louder, I wonder if it would be easier to just stop, to let them catch me, to see what happens next. But I can't, not yet. So I'll keep running, keep looking over my shoulder, keep trying to stay one step ahead. But I know, deep down, that it's only a matter of time. They're getting closer, and I'm running out of places to hide. When we first moved into that old house at the edge of town, I thought we were getting the deal of a lifetime. A spacious Victorian with a large backyard for the kids to play in and enough rooms for everyone to have their own space. My wife, Sarah, was thrilled to finally have a home that felt like it had history, a place we could make our own. We didn't really think much about the rumors that had been swirling around the house. People talked, of course. They said the last family who lived here vanished without a trace, that the father had gone mad, or the mother had run away with the kids. The realtor brushed it off, saying it was just small-town gossip. But even though we tried to ignore it, there was something about those stories that lingered in the back of my mind, like a splinter you can't quite dig out. Our first day was spent unpacking and arranging furniture. The kids, Emma, who's 10, and Jack, who's 6, were excited to explore. They ran from room to room, claiming their new territories and imagining all the adventures they'd have. Everything felt new and fresh, full of potential. It was only later, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows crept in, that I noticed it. A faint, almost imperceptible hum, like a distant conversation just beyond hearing. I shrugged it off as settling noises. Old houses always have a few quirks, right? The first night was uneventful. We were exhausted from the move, and everyone fell asleep quickly. But around midnight, I woke up to what I thought was someone whispering in the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. I could just make out the words, a soft murmur, almost as if someone was standing right outside our bedroom door. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and crept toward the door. The whispering stopped as soon as I reached the hallway. I stood there in the dark, feeling foolish. There was nothing there. The house was silent, save for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. I chalked it up to my imagination. Stress from the move, I told myself. I went back to bed, but it took a long time for sleep to find me again. Over the next few days, little things started happening. Emma's dolls would be arranged in strange patterns, all facing the same direction, even though she swore she hadn't touched them. Jack complained about nightmares, saying he saw faces in his bedroom walls, but we brushed it off as just a child's overactive imagination. Sarah noticed it too. She said she felt like she was being watched, especially in the kitchen. I tried to reassure her, but the truth was, I felt it too. There was a heaviness in the air, a sensation like we weren't alone. Then the voices started. At first, they were faint, just a low buzz coming from the walls at night. But soon, they grew louder, clearer. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, whispering secrets that we couldn't quite make out. It wasn't just one voice either. There were many, all overlapping, sometimes arguing, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying. We tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The voices were always there, growing louder every night. I tried to find the source, thinking maybe it was a problem with the old plumbing or some sort of electrical interference. But the voices didn't come from any specific place. They seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. One afternoon, while clearing out the attic, I found an old leather-bound journal hidden under a loose floorboard. It belonged to the previous owner, a man named David Miller. As I'd flipped through the pages, my heart sank. He described the same things we were experiencing: whispers, shadows, the feeling of being watched. He wrote about his wife and kids, how they'd grown distant, frightened, how the house had changed them. The last entry was dated the day they disappeared. They won't leave us alone. The voices are in the walls. They say they want to come back, that they were here first. I can hear them all the time now. I don't know how much longer we can stay. I have to protect my family. I have to. The writing trailed off into an illegible scroll. I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to make of it. Was this man insane, or was there something more to this house? I didn't tell Sarah or the kids about the journal. They were already on edge, and I didn't want to make things worse. But I kept it close, hidden in the nightstand by my bed, as if the words themselves could protect us. The voices didn't stop. If anything, they became more insistent. They were angry now, demanding. We tried to go about our lives, but it was like living in a pressure cooker, the tension building day by day. Emma and Jack became withdrawn, pale shadows of their former selves. Sarah barely slept, her eyes dark with exhaustion and fear. One night, I woke up to find Sarah standing in the living room, staring at the wall. Her face was blank, her eyes unfocused. "Sarah?" I whispered, touching her arm. She turned to me slowly, as if waking from a dream. "They're here," she said, her voice flat and hollow. "They want us to leave." I looked at the wall she'd been staring at and felt a cold shiver run down my spine. There, etched into the plaster, were words. Scratched in deep, jagged letters, GE tabbed. We packed our bags that night. I didn't care where we went, we just had to leave. But as we tried to leave, the front door wouldn't budge. It was as if it was sealed shut. The windows too. We were trapped. Desperation set in. The voices grew louder, shrieking, laughing, mocking us. I could barely think, barely breathe. The kids were terrified, huddling together in their room. Sarah was catatonic, staring blankly at the walls as if she could see through them. I tried everything, smashing the windows, breaking down the door. Nothing worked. We were prisoners in our own home, surrounded by something I couldn't understand. One night, I finally snapped. I grabbed the journal and began tearing through it, looking for answers. There had to be something, some way to make it stop. And then I found it. A single sentence, scrawled in the margin. They want someone to stay. I stared at the words, my mind racing. What did that mean? And then it hit me. The last family had disappeared. But what if they hadn't? What if they were still here, trapped like we were? What if they were the voices? I knew what I had to do. I didn't want to, but there was no other choice. If I didn't, we'd never get out. I took the journal and a knife and went to the living room. I could feel them watching, waiting. "I'll stay," I whispered, the words choking me. "Just let them go." The voices fell silent, a heavy stillness settling over the room. I glanced back at the stairs, where Sarah and the kids were sleeping. I hoped they'd forgive me for what I was about to do. I raised the knife end. The front door creaked open. A cold wind blew through the house, and the voices began to laugh, a low, terrible sound that echoed through the walls. I dropped the knife and ran to the stairs, shouting for Sarah and the kids. They were gone. I searched the house, but it was empty. The voices were gone too, replaced by a silence so profound it was suffocating. I stumbled outside into the cold night air. The house loomed behind me, dark and empty, its windows staring like hollow eyes. I left that night, drove until I couldn't drive anymore. I didn't know where I was going, I just needed to get away. But no matter how far I went, I could still hear them, whispering. I never saw Sarah or the kids again. I don't know what happened to them or to the family before us. But sometimes, late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of their faces in the shadows. I'll hear their voices calling from the walls. And I know, deep down, that I'll never be free. Because I stayed. It's been years since I left that house, but I still keep an eye on it, sometimes driving by in the dead of night. It's changed hands a few times, new families moving in, trying to make it a home. They never last long. I saw the for sale sign go up again last week. Another family will move in soon, no doubt. They'll paint the walls, rearrange the furniture, try to make it their own. But I know the truth. The house belongs to them now, to the voices in the walls, and they won't stop until they get what they want, because they always want someone to stay, and someone always does. I've always been skeptical of the supernatural. Ghosts, spirits, haunted houses, they were all just stories people told to scare themselves. That was until the night I found the note in my bedroom. It was a typical Friday evening. I was in my room, lying on my bed with my phone in hand, scrolling through social media. My parents were downstairs watching TV, and everything seemed normal. I remember it was almost 11 p.m. when I decided to call it a night. As I stood up to turn off the lights, something caught my eye. There on my desk was a piece of paper that hadn't been there before. My room was locked from the inside, and I hadn't let anyone in. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I walked over to the desk. The note was hastily written in red ink, the words smudged in places as if the writer had been in a hurry. "Leave the house immediately. Don't let them find you." I stared at the note, confused. Who would write this? And what did it mean by them? My first thought was that it was some sort of prank. Maybe one of my friends sneaked in somehow, trying to mess with me. But how would they have gotten into my locked room? I checked the windows, locked. I checked the door, locked. My heart was pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself that it was just a joke. But as I picked up the note, I noticed something odd. The handwriting looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. I decided to show it to my parents, thinking they'd either be able to explain it or at least share a good laugh with me. I headed downstairs, but as I reached the living room, I stopped. My parents were sitting on the couch, but they weren't moving. The TV was on, but there was no sound. It was as if time had frozen around them. I called out, but they didn't respond. Panic began to creep in. I walked closer, my hands trembling, and gently shook my mom's shoulder. She didn't budge. It was like she was in a trance, staring blankly at the TV screen. I turned to my dad, but he was the same. I felt the air grow thick around me, a suffocating presence pressing down on my chest. I backed away slowly, clutching the note in my hand. This had to be a dream, a nightmare I'd wake up from any second now. But everything felt too real. My heart was racing, and I could feel the sweat forming on my forehead. I ran back to my room, slamming the door shut behind me. I needed to think. Who could have written this note? And why were my parents acting like this? I pulled out my phone and tried calling for help, but there was no signal. No bars, no Wi-Fi, nothing. That's when I heard it. A faint, shuffling noise, like someone or something was moving just outside my room. I froze, holding my breath. The sound grew louder, footsteps echoing down the hallway. It stopped right outside my door. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No response. I looked around my room, searching for something to defend myself with. My eyes landed on a baseball bat leaning against the corner. I grabbed it, holding it tightly, my knuckles turning white. The door handle slowly began to turn, and I felt my heart drop to my stomach. I took a step back, raising the bat, ready to swing at whatever came through that door. But the door didn't open. Instead, the handle turned back into place, and the shuffling moved away, down the hall, and toward the stairs. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening to the silence. Then, I heard a low, guttural whisper, barely audible, but it sent chills down my spine. "Leave, leave before they come for you." It was the same voice I'd heard in my head when I read the note. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run out of the house, just like the note said. But another part of me felt glued to the spot, paralyzed by fear and confusion. I finally gathered the courage to open my door, peering out into the dark hallway. The house was eerily quiet. I tiptoed to the top of the stairs, looking down into the shadowy living room. My parents were still on the couch, motionless. I needed to get out of here. I couldn't explain it, but every fiber of my being was screaming at me to leave. I ran back to my room, grabbed my backpack, and threw in whatever I could find: my phone charger, some clothes, a flashlight. As I was about to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was another note, this time on my pillow. It hadn't been there before. "Hurry, they're coming." I didn't think twice. I grabbed the note and stuffed it in my pocket before bolting out of my room. I made my way down the stairs, past my frozen parents, and toward the front door. As I reached for the doorknob, a loud crash echoed from behind me. I turned around, and my heart nearly stopped. The lights in the living room were flickering, and I could see shadows moving, distorted, twisted figures writhing and shifting in the dim light. They were coming from the walls, crawling out of the shadows like some nightmare come to life. I yanked the door open and ran outside, not daring to look back. I didn't stop running until I reached the end of the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I glanced back at my house, expecting to see those shadowy figures following me, but the house looked normal. Everything was still, except for the faint hum of the streetlights and the chirping of crickets. I didn't know what to do or where to go. I was too scared to go back, but I couldn't just stand there in the middle of the street. I decided to go to my friend Jake's house. He lived a few blocks away, and I knew he'd let me crash at his place for the night. I started walking, my heart still pounding, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. Who wrote those notes? What were those things in my house? And why were my parents acting so strange? I reached Jake's house and banged on the door, hoping he was still awake. After a few moments, the porch light flicked on, and Jake opened the door, rubbing his eyes. "Dude, what's going on?" he asked, looking confused and concerned. I hesitated, not sure how to explain what had just happened. I don't know. Something weird is going on at my place. I found this note, and my parents. My voice broke as I realized how crazy I sounded. Jake just stared at me, his expression turning from confusion to worry. "Come in, man. You look like you've seen a ghost." I stepped inside, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over me. Maybe I could finally figure out what was happening. Jake made some hot chocolate, and we sat in his living room as I tried to explain everything. He listened quietly, his eyes widening with every word. When I finished, he was silent for a moment before finally speaking. "That's messed up, dude. You're sure you didn't imagine it?" I shook my head. "I know it sounds crazy, but I'm not making this up. The notes, the shadows, they were real. I saw them." Jake nodded slowly, looking deep in thought. "Maybe we should go back, check it out together. I mean, if your parents are still there, we should make sure they're okay." The idea of going back to that house made my skin crawl, but he was right. I couldn't just leave my parents there, even if they were acting strange. We grabbed a couple of flashlights and made our way back to my house. The walk felt like an eternity, every shadow in the dark making my heart race. When we finally reached my house, everything looked the same as when I'd left. The lights were still on, and the front door was slightly ajar. We stepped inside, and I called out, "Mom? Dad?" No answer. The living room was empty, the TV still on but showing nothing but static. My parents were gone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Jake turned to me, his face pale. "Maybe they left. Maybe they're looking for you." I wanted to believe him, but something told me that wasn't true. We searched the house, but it was empty. There were no signs of my parents or those shadowy figures I'd seen earlier. Everything was just gone. I was about to suggest we leave when Jake pointed to the kitchen table. There was another note, identical to the ones I'd found earlier. You shouldn't have come back. My heart sank, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Jake picked up the note, his hands shaking. What the hell is this, man? Who's doing this? I didn't have an answer. I felt like I was losing my mind. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I turned my head slowly, and there, in the hallway leading to the basement, was a figure. Tall, dark, and almost translucent, it seemed to be watching us, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I couldn't breathe. My body was frozen in place as the figure began to move toward us, its steps slow and deliberate. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there like a helpless child, but I couldn't move. Jake grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my trance. We need to get out of here. We bolted for the front door, the figure right behind us. I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, like a heady fog pressing down on me. We burst out of the house and didn't stop running until we were back at Jake's place, gasping for breath. We collapsed on his porch, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I pulled the notes out of my pocket, staring at them as if they held the answers to everything. But they didn't. They were just words, meaningless and terrifying. Over the next few days, things only got worse. My parents never came back. I went to the police, but they couldn't find any trace of them. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. I stayed with Jake for a while, too scared to go back to my house. But the notes followed me. Every morning, I'd wake up to find a new one, always in the same red ink, always with the same message. Leave before it's too late. I tried ignoring them, but the warnings grew more urgent, the handwriting more frantic. I felt like I was being watched, even in broad daylight. I started seeing shadows moving in the corners of my eyes, hearing whispers in the dead of night. And then, one day, Jake found a note in his room. It was the same handwriting, the same red ink. He's here. We knew we couldn't stay there. We packed our things and left town, driving for hours until we were miles away from everything we knew. We found a cheap motel and checked in, hoping we'd be safe. That night, I woke up to the sound of someone whispering my name. I turned on the light, my heart pounding, and there, on the nightstand, was another note. You can't escape. I screamed, waking Jake up. We tore out of that motel and kept driving, not knowing where we were going, just needing to get away. But no matter how far we went, the notes followed. They were everywhere, in my bag, in my pockets, under the windshield wipers of the car. I realized then that we couldn't run from this. Whatever it wasn't just in my house. It was with me, always watching, always waiting. We ended up back in town, out of options and exhausted. I went back to my house, hoping to find some answers. The place was abandoned, just as we'd left it. But as I stepped inside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in notes, thousands of them, all saying the same thing. Leave before it's too late. And in the center of the room, standing there with a twisted smile on his face, was a figure. I recognized him instantly. It was me. Or at least it looked like me. He stepped closer, his eyes glowing with a sickly light. You shouldn't have come back, he said in a voice that was mine but not mine. I tried to move, but I couldn't. The figure reached out, his hand cold and solid, and placed a note in my hand. You've been warned, he whispered. And then, everything went black. I don't remember what happened after that. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, my body covered in cuts and bruises. They told me I'd been found in my house, unconscious and alone. Jake was gone. My parents were gone. Everyone I knew had disappeared, leaving me alone with my nightmares. I still see the notes sometimes, scribbled in the corners of my mind. I hear the whispers in the dark, telling me to leave, to run. But I know it's too late. There's no escaping what's already inside you. And now, as I write this, I can feel him watching, waiting for me to finish. You've been warned. But who will warn the next person?